Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Drawbridge Trap, Gatehouse Defenses and Deadly Surprises. Imagine standing at the edge of a yawning stone chasm, the air damp and cold, water dark and sluggish below. Before you rises the formidable gatehouse of a medieval castle and architectural marvel, and simultaneously, a trap designed to crush, impale, or starve anyone daring enough to cross its threshold. The gatehouse was the castle's first line of defense, yet its brilliance lay in subtleties the casual visitor or even the most confident assailant would rarely appreciate. Here, every hinge, groove, and mechanism mattered, and understanding them unveils a world of danger that the medieval mind meticulously planned for. The drawbridge, perhaps the most famous element of the gatehouse, was far more than a wooden platform lowered to let visitors in. In truth, it was a carefully orchestrated balance of timber, iron chains, and counterweights, all engineered for speed and lethality. A single misstep or a single misjudged calculation could leave an intruder dangling over icy water, or worse, plunging to their death. You might think the drawbridge was merely a convenience, but in reality, it was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Attackers approached with caution, aware that the moment they stepped onto the planks, gravity itself could turn against them. Inside the gatehouse, mechanisms were hidden behind walls and beneath stone floors. Portcullises, a heavy, spiked grating of iron or wood, could be dropped in seconds, cutting off entry or crushing unwary soldiers. What many fail to realize is that these portcullises were rarely operated alone. Castle architects designed them to work in tandem with murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which defenders poured boiling water, hot sand, or oil, or shot arrows at enemies trapped below. The experience of entering a gatehouse was not unlike moving through a maze of unseen hazards. At any given moment, someone above could be watching, waiting for the precise instant to release a deadly trap. The accounts of sieges from the 12th and 13th centuries make this terrifyingly clear. During the siege of Shade-au-Gaillard in 1203–1204, attackers repeatedly attempted to storm the gatehouse. Chroniclers describe the terror of men who thought themselves safe beneath the drawbridge, only to be caught in layers of portcullises, each drop designed to trap and disorient. These weren't haphazard defenses. Every element was meticulously tested, with engineers recalibrating chains, weights, and gears to ensure maximum efficiency. The drawbridge itself was often double-layered, with a second, hidden trapdoor beneath the main platform. One false step, and a soldier might fall into a pit lined with sharpened stakes or a hidden water chamber, turning what seemed like a routine crossing into an ordeal of survival. Yet the drawbridge and portcullis were not merely physical barriers, they imposed a mental strain that was equally lethal. Imagine approaching a fortress after weeks of marching, exhaustion weighing down your arms and legs. Hunger gnaws at your resolve, your mind races with thoughts of survival, and then you encounter the gatehouse. The planks above you sway slightly, chains creak ominously, and the shadow of murder holes looms over every step. Soldiers were trained for battle, but nothing could fully prepare them for the psychological terror of a gatehouse designed to exploit hesitation, fear, and instinct. The castle's defenders understood this intimately. Some accounts even suggest that the defenders used sound rolling boulders, the sudden clanging of chains to heighten the sense of imminent danger. The gatehouse was as much a theater of fear as it was a defensive structure. Daily life within the gatehouse for those defending it was just as relentless. Guards had to maintain chains, lubricate gears, and inspect planks and portcullises for weaknesses. One overlooked rusted hinge could mean disaster, and one careless misplacement of sand in a murder hole could allow an enemy to breach the walls. Guards often slept in shifts within these cramped spaces, never knowing if the next knock at the gate would bring merchants, messengers, or marauders ready to test the fortifications. The monotony of maintaining such defenses was punctuated by moments of high-stakes decision-making. Every day, defenders balanced careful routine with sudden crisis management. It was a life where boredom and terror existed side by side, a rhythm of preparation and anticipation that shaped every waking hour. Castle architects also considered the terrain around the gatehouse. Approaches were often deliberately engineered to funnel attackers into narrow, exposed lanes. Ditches, spiked stakes, and uneven ground forced soldiers into slow, predictable movements, making them easier targets for defenders. In essence, the gatehouse was not merely a point of entry, it was the first stage of a deadly game. Every architectural choice, from the height of the walls to the angle of the bridge planks, was made to maximize control over who entered, how they moved, and what risks they faced. Even seemingly mundane elements could be deadly. Iron rings embedded in stone walls allowed defenders to tie ropes or nets that could trap horses, while wooden beams might be rigged to fall or swing unexpectedly. The very sound of the gatehouse, the creaking of chains, the groan of timber, the faint drip of water was part of the defensive strategy. Attackers, already fatigued and wary, found themselves unnerved by the subtle interplay of sound and structure. In these moments, the psychological aspect of the drawbridge trap became clear. Fear could be as effective as any weapon. It is important to note that while modern imagination often focuses on violent encounters, much of the gatehouse's terror came from anticipation and uncertainty. Soldiers could spend hours or days outside the walls, aware that at any moment the slightest mistake might mean death or capture. Chroniclers frequently mention that the worst casualties during sieges were not always from direct combat, but from falls, crushing accidents, and misjudged steps while navigating these complex entryways. The drawbridge and portcullis were instruments of control, designed to exploit both physical vulnerability and human psychology. Yet for all its sophistication, the gatehouse was not infallible. Skilled attackers learned to study patterns, observe shifts, and sometimes bribe or deceive guards. Counterweights could fail, gears could rust, and sometimes a castle's own defenders miscalculated, leading to tragic accidents within the gatehouse itself. This duality, where a structure could protect and kill, defend and betray, added a persistent tension to castle life. For those who built, maintained, or attacked it, the gatehouse represented both ingenuity and danger, a reminder that survival in the medieval world depended as much on knowledge and preparation as on strength and courage. As the sun sets over the moats and the shadows of the towers stretch across the water, you might imagine yourself approaching such a gatehouse. Would you trust the ancient timber underfoot? Could you spot the hidden pitfalls? Or would the carefully concealed dangers claim you before you even reach the walls? The drawbridge trap, in all its mechanical elegance and deadly subtlety, leaves one final question lingering in the mind. What was the human cost of designing a place where every step could be your last? And how many lives, defenders and attackers alike, were quietly sacrificed to perfect this balance of fear and function? The gatehouse, with its intricate mechanisms of fear, was only as effective as the people who manned it. Beyond the swinging portcullis and the ominous planks of the drawbridge lay a world of ceaseless vigilance, labor, and subtle terror, life behind the walls that most outsiders never glimpsed. For the guards, gatehouse duty was a mixture of routine, boredom, and the constant threat of instant death. Unlike the soldiers on the battlefield, whose roles were often brief and spectacular, the gatehouse demanded a sustained attention to danger over months or years, a monotony punctuated by moments of extreme peril. Morning in the gatehouse began quietly, often before dawn. A single torch flickered along the stone walls, casting elongated shadows across the floor. Guards would stretch cramped limbs, check weapons for rust, and inspect the chains that held the drawbridge. Every rope and gear was examined, for the smallest failure could be catastrophic. The daily rituals were surprisingly precise, oiling hinges, tightening bolts, and checking for rot in wooden beams. These were the boring tasks that determined life or death. A neglected chain could snap when the drawbridge was released, sending soldiers or horses plunging into the moat. A loose stone in the portcullis groove could jam it at a critical moment, leaving the castle vulnerable to assault. The psychological weight of these routines was immense. Guards knew that even minor errors could have fatal consequences, yet the human mind struggled with prolonged monotony. To cope, they developed rituals marking the hours with the chime of a distant bell, counting planks on the drawbridge, or tracing patterns in the stone walls. Some resorted to small personal routines, carving initials or dates into timber, as if leaving a trace of their existence might anchor them against the ever-present anxiety. These rituals were quiet acts of survival in a life dominated by mechanisms of death. Interaction with the outside world was another source of stress. Travelers, messengers, merchants, and occasionally nobles approached the gatehouse daily, each encounter a potential threat. Guards had to distinguish friend from foe in seconds, often with only subtle visual cues, a particular seal, the way someone carried themselves, or the sound of their horse. Mistakes could be fatal. History records countless incidents in which a gatekeeper's hesitation or misjudgment led to the capture or massacre of both defenders and visitors. And yet, the same gatehouse might also harbor the tension of deception. Spies disguised as traders, or mercenaries hiding weapons beneath mundane cargo. Every knock at the gate was a test of vigilance, patience, and judgment. Inside, the architecture of fear continued to shape daily life. The murder holes, often seen from above, required careful maintenance. Guards assigned to these posts had to rehearse precise coordination, timing the release of arrows or boiling liquids to maximize effect, while minimizing accidental injury to their comrades. This was painstaking work. A miscalculation could burn the wrong staircase or send a splash of hot oil into a corridor where a fellow defender stood. Such accidents were common, and the gatehouse slowly gained a reputation as a place where danger was omnipresent, not only from outsiders but also from the castle itself. Life extended beyond just physical survival. Food, water, and basic comforts were surprisingly difficult to secure within a gatehouse. Supplies had to be hoisted up from kitchens, often through narrow corridors or via pulley systems over the drawbridge. The stone walls trapped cold and dampness, making the space uncomfortable in winter, while the constant proximity to open air could be bitter during storms. Soldiers and guards learned to endure discomfort as part of their duty. Many accounts describe thick woolen clothing, layered armor, and improvised bedding that barely softened the cold stone floors. Hunger was a constant companion. Meals were often meager, hastily prepared, and consumed between shifts. Yet the deprivation itself became a tool of training, hunting resilience and patience, the very qualities required to manage the deadly mechanisms they operated daily. The human element of the gatehouse extended to social hierarchy as well. Senior guards supervised younger recruits, teaching them not only the technical aspects of defense, but also the psychological endurance required to handle prolonged exposure to danger. Mistakes were corrected harshly. Failure could mean reassignment to more perilous posts or demotion. The subtle interplay between authority and obedience shaped how effectively the gatehouse functioned. Guards had to learn discipline not just for themselves, but to trust that their comrades above and below would act with equal care in times of crisis. Even during periods of calm, the gatehouse was far from peaceful. Rats scuttled along walls, attracted by the proximity to kitchens or refuse pits, carrying disease and nibbling at exposed food. Damp stone bred mold, and stagnant water in moats and drainage systems contributed to foul smells and occasional outbreaks of illness. Guards faced the threat of sickness in addition to injury, and medical care was rudimentary at best. Even minor wounds could fester, and a single infection could incapacitate a defender for weeks. The mundane, relentless hazards of gatehouse life were as deadly as any sword or siege engine. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this environment was the human capacity for adaptation. Over centuries, gatehouses evolved, not only in architecture but in the daily habits of those who inhabited them. Soldiers devised routines to maintain alertness, reinforced mental fortitude, and learned to read subtle changes in sound or shadow. They developed unspoken codes of communication: a shift in a torch's flame, the tap of a boot on stone to convey warnings or instructions without attracting unwanted attention. Life inside the gatehouse demanded constant awareness, but it also fostered ingenuity and resilience. Each day, defenders balanced fear with necessity, crafting survival strategies that would often determine the outcome of sieges. Yet despite these adaptations, the gatehouse remained a place of paradox. It was a sanctuary and a trap, a workplace and a theater of death. Those who survived often did so by navigating a delicate balance between mechanical precision, social coordination, and sheer psychological endurance. And even the most experienced guards were never fully secure. Siege engines, ladders, tunneling attempts, and clever attackers could turn a fortified gatehouse into a site of sudden chaos. The intricate systems of chains, planks, and ironwork were both protective and perilous, demanding that every human within its walls constantly negotiate between control and vulnerability. As night fell and torches flickered along the stone walls, the shadows cast by the portcullis stretched across the courtyard. Guards huddled near murder holes, listening to the faint sounds of the surrounding landscape: the rustle of animals in the moat, the distant clatter of a messenger, the wind carrying an uneasy note of threat. Each noise might be benign, or it might signal the approach of enemies who would test the defenses to their limits. The gatehouse, in all its ingenuity and danger, remained a stage where human skill, endurance, and fear intersected. And even as you consider the precise movements of chains, the careful calibration of counterweights, and the tireless vigilance of the men who operated them, one question lingers. When the gatehouse failed, whether through human error, mechanical malfunction, or sheer force, what became of those trapped inside? And how many lives were quietly lost to the delicate balance of terror and survival? The sun had barely risen over the castle's moat when the first signs of an approaching enemy appeared. A distant cloud of dust indicated the movement of mounted soldiers, their banners flapping, weapons glinting faintly in the pale light. Inside the gatehouse, guards prepared for the inevitable. Months of tedious maintenance, endless inspections, and the silent hum of anxiety culminated in this single, defining moment. Every chain, plank, and iron spike they had studied, repaired, and reinforced was about to be tested, and the outcome would determine the fate of everyone inside the walls. Sieges were rare but catastrophic. Historical records, from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 to countless minor skirmishes at smaller keeps, show that attackers often underestimated the complexity and lethality of gatehouse defenses. They approached with ladders, siege towers, and crude battering rams, only to find themselves funneled into narrow corridors where every movement could be observed and countered. From their perspective, the drawbridge appeared functional but harmless. From the defenders' point of view, it was a carefully honed mechanism designed to exploit hesitation, fatigue, and panic. The first wave of attackers reached the moat. The drawbridge, lowered just long enough for reconnaissance, held steady under the weight of horses and men. Yet, as the soldiers advanced, hidden chains silently released, tilting the wooden planks. Screams echoed as horses stumbled, dragging riders into the icy water below. For those unprepared for the trap, the experience was sudden, shocking, and often fatal. The portcullis above was already in motion, a wall of iron descending with a deep, resonant clang that would crush anyone caught underneath. Every element of the gatehouse worked in unison, the result of decades of architectural evolution and practical experimentation. Inside the murder holes, defenders poured boiling water, arrows, and sand onto the intruders below. Chroniclers of the time describe how these attacks were not merely physical, they were psychological. Panic spread quickly among soldiers trapped in a narrow space, with no room to maneuver, and the threat of death above and below. The precise timing required by defenders meant that every action was critical. Even a single miscalculation could allow a survivor to escape and return with reinforcements. Gatehouse combat, therefore, was as much about coordination and focus as it was about brute force. Yet despite the sophistication of these defenses, failure was always possible. Siege engines could batter doors, clever miners could undermine walls, and skilled spies might bribe or infiltrate to disable mechanisms from within. Every historical account of a breached gatehouse emphasizes that victory often required ingenuity, patience, and relentless pressure. Some attacks lasted weeks or months, with defenders enduring extreme hunger, disease, and exhaustion while maintaining the deadly balance of their traps. Survival depended on maintaining mental acuity under stress, reinforcing mechanical systems, and holding onto discipline when everything seemed to collapse around them. One notable example comes from the siege of Shade al-Gaylard, where defenders managed to delay a vastly superior French army for months. Chroniclers recount how the gatehouse itself was the site of multiple deadly encounters. Men fell into pits beneath the drawbridge, ladders were toppled by carefully released beams, and arrows rained down from murder holes. For the defenders, the gatehouse was both a sanctuary and a crucible, a place where fear and strategy intersected to determine life and death. The psychological toll on those inside was immense. Many suffered trauma and exhaustion even after the immediate threat passed. Life after a siege was rarely peaceful. Survivors carried the memory of trapped bodies, shattered mechanisms, and near-death experiences. Guards and soldiers often recounted stories of misjudged movements, near misses, and the merciless precision of the gatehouse's design. These accounts provide a window into the human cost of castle defense, highlighting the duality of medieval architecture, designed to protect, yet inherently dangerous. The drawbridge trap, in particular, was a lesson in the interplay between human psychology, mechanical ingenuity, and the stark realities of medieval life. Interestingly, the influence of these gatehouses extended beyond immediate survival. The constant threat of traps and lethal architecture shaped medieval military strategy, social organization, and even diplomacy. Lords relied on well-defended castles to assert authority, deter rebellion, and control surrounding lands. Soldiers trained to endure the gatehouse's pressures became disciplined and resilient, qualities that influenced broader military campaigns. The psychological lessons of fear, anticipation, and calculated response, honed in these small, confined spaces, echoed across larger battlefields and influenced tactics far beyond the castle walls. As time passed, some castles fell into ruin, but the legacy of their defensive design persisted. Modern engineers studying medieval architecture often marvel at the precision and foresight required to create effective gatehouse traps. Yet for those who lived through them, the memory was visceral, not technical. They recalled the cold touch of iron, the sway of planks underfoot, the screams of horses and men, and the omnipresent tension of waiting for disaster to strike. The drawbridge was not merely a tool. It was a teacher of vigilance, patience, and survival, demanding that humans negotiate both the physical and psychological challenges of danger in its most precise form. Finally, as you imagine walking across a medieval drawbridge, the sound of chains creaking underfoot, torches flickering along the walls, you realize that these structures were more than defensive, they were living instruments of fear and strategy. Every hinge, every plank, every portcullis, and murder hole contributed to a delicate ecosystem where one misstep could be fatal. Yet through ingenuity, coordination, and resilience, humans learn not only to survive but also to thrive within this perilous architecture. The drawbridge trap remains a testament to the relentless human desire for control, protection, and adaptation, and a chilling reminder of how ordinary structures, when designed with precision and intent, can become instruments of terror. In the end, the gatehouse teaches us a final lesson. History is not only about battles or kings, but also about the hidden spaces where ordinary humans confronted danger daily. It asks us to reflect how many of the people who walked these planks survived only through vigilance, ingenuity, and endurance, and how much of our modern understanding of security, strategy, and risk owes its roots to these silent, terrifying stone corridors. Story 2: The Silent Watchers, Life of Castle Guards in Nightly Terror. Night fell early over the castle, and with it came a quiet tension that was almost palpable. The battlements, long empty in the sunlight, were now alive with the footsteps of guards, their boots echoing on damp stone. You, as one of these silent watchers, are stationed in the turret, overlooking the surrounding landscape. The wind whistles through arrow loops, carrying the smell of smoke from the kitchen below and the faint, earthy tang of the moat. Every movement in the shadows could signal danger: a prowling fox, a stray servant, or, more dangerously, an enemy scout testing the castle's defenses. Being a castle guard was not the romanticized life of shining armor and heroic battles. Most of your day is spent in tedium, punctuated by sudden, terrifying moments when vigilance becomes a matter of life and death. From your perch in the turret, you must monitor multiple layers of security: the drawbridge, the gatehouse, the outer walls, and the surrounding terrain. Every noise: rushing water from the moat, rustling leaves, a branch snapping underfoot, demands attention. The night itself is a weapon. Darkness is both ally and adversary, concealing threats while limiting your own vision. Guards worked in shifts, often of 4 or 6 hours, which may sound manageable but is anything but. Cold stone floors, damp walls, and stiff armor make even short periods uncomfortable. Hunger gnaws as meals are sparse and hurried. Sleep is impossible here. One moment of inattentiveness could allow a saboteur to slip unnoticed into the castle grounds. You must remain alert, scanning the darkened landscape, listening to subtle variations in sound, feeling vibrations in the stone from footsteps, or the faint clatter of a horse's hoof on the far side of the moat. Fatigue and monotony test your mental fortitude, while the knowledge that failure could be fatal never leaves your mind. In addition to environmental threats, the social hierarchy of guards adds another layer of complexity. Senior watchmen oversee younger recruits, correcting mistakes immediately and often harshly. Commands must be obeyed with precision, as errors in coordination could open gaps in the castle's defenses. Guards quickly learn that personal survival depends not just on their own skill, but on the reliability of their comrades. Trust is earned through repetition, competence, and the ability to maintain calm under pressure. A single panic-stricken or negligent guard can compromise an entire battlement. The routine of patrols is deceptively monotonous. You walk the battlements, check for loose stones or weak spots in the walls, inspect gate mechanisms, and make note of any suspicious activity in the surrounding area. Yet beneath this monotony lies a world of subtle observation and anticipation. Small signs, often overlooked by untrained eyes, can reveal impending danger. The way a tree branch moves, the glint of metal in moonlight, or footprints in the dirt around the moat. Guards trained for years could read these cues instinctively, their senses finely tuned to detect threats before they became immediate. Historical accounts describe nights filled with fear as much as labor. During the siege of Dover Castle in 1216, for instance, chroniclers noted that guards would spend hours in complete silence, listening for the faintest sounds of enemy activity. Even routine tasks, like signaling to a nearby turret or ensuring the drawbridge chains were properly tensioned, had to be performed with care to avoid betraying the castle's presence. The psychological burden was immense. The line between vigilance and paranoia was often blurred, yet survival demanded that guards maintain the delicate balance. The dangers of the night were not always external. Within the castle walls, mistakes could be just as deadly. A misread signal, a neglected inspection, or even tripping over uneven stone could result in falls or accidents. Medieval architecture, while designed for defense, often imposed physical hazards on those who inhabited it. Narrow staircases, low ceilings, and steep battlements created situations where a moment's distraction could prove fatal. Guards had to navigate these dangers routinely, their awareness and reflexes tested constantly. Some of the most terrifying aspects of guarding a castle at night were the invisible ones: disease carried by rats in the rafters, damp stone that sapped warmth and energy, and the ever-present possibility of supernatural fear. Medieval superstition ran deep, and even seasoned soldiers reported feelings of unease, ghostly sounds, or shadows that seemed to move on their own. While modern eyes might dismiss these as imagination, in the context of exhaustion, darkness, and relentless tension, these fears were psychologically real and could affect a guard's performance, sometimes with deadly consequences. The equipment and weaponry of a guard were as much a part of the routine as vigilance itself. Bows, crossbows, pikes, and swords had to be kept in constant readiness. Armor, though heavy and uncomfortable, was necessary to survive sudden skirmishes. Even the torches and lanterns had to be meticulously maintained. A torch going out at the wrong moment could leave a turret in darkness, providing perfect cover for an intruder. Supplies had to be rationed and prepared carefully, because a lack of arrows, a broken chain, or a misaligned battlement could nullify hours of careful preparation. The life of a castle guard was thus defined by contrasts: monotony and sudden terror, isolation and interdependence, control and helplessness. Night after night, guards developed skills not only in observation and combat but also in endurance, resilience, and the ability to manage fear. They learned to anticipate not just the movements of enemies but the subtle rhythms of the castle itself, the way the stones settled in cold weather, the sounds of animals in the moat, and even the shifting patterns of moonlight across the walls. Every night, the castle became both a protective fortress and a labyrinth of hazards, testing the limits of human perception and courage. Even within the mundane, small moments of triumph occurred. A guard spotting an intruder before they reached the walls, signaling a threat in time to close the drawbridge, or noticing a weak point in a wall before it could be exploited, all were victories, often uncelebrated but critical. These small acts of competence and attention to detail kept the castle safe, preserved lives, and allowed the daily routines of medieval life to continue beyond the fortifications. Yet each victory was tempered by the knowledge that the next night would bring similar challenges, perhaps even deadlier. As you imagine standing in a dark turret, listening to the wind swirl around the battlements, you realize the true horror of the castle guard's existence. It is not the single moment of attack that defines danger, but the relentless, unbroken tension of living within structures designed for both defense and death. The night is long, the cold stone unforgiving, and the moat below a constant reminder of the fragility of human life. And in this prolonged vigilance, one question arises: how did these silent watchers endure year after year, facing the psychological weight of constant fear, monotony, and deadly responsibility without breaking? As the sun dips below the horizon and darkness stretches across the castle's walls, the life of a guard shifts from routine to survival. Daylight, with its mundane tasks and predictable rhythms, gives way to the uncertainty of night. This is when the silent watchers prove their worth not through heroics on a battlefield, but through endurance, patience, and the capacity to remain alert when the mind is desperate for rest. In this section, we explore the personal realities of these men and women whose lives revolved around vigilance, fear, and the small acts that kept the castle safe. The nightly patrol begins with preparation. Guards must check their weapons, from bows and crossbows to swords and pikes, ensuring that each piece is functional and ready for action. A dull blade or misfiring crossbow could mean the difference between life and death. Armor, cumbersome and often rusted from exposure to damp stone, must be fitted correctly to allow both mobility and protection. Torches must be lit, lanterns fueled, and lookout positions reinforced with spare materials. These preparatory rituals, repetitive as they may seem, were essential for survival. A single lapse could be catastrophic, whether it involved a malfunctioning drawbridge mechanism, a hidden weak point in the wall, or a lapse in observation. One of the most significant challenges guards faced was psychological endurance. Unlike the chaos of open battle, nighttime vigilance demanded sustained attention with little feedback. A soldier might spend hours scanning moonlit fields, counting the minutes until dawn, every shadow a potential threat. Boredom and fear existed side by side, each feeding the other. Medieval chroniclers frequently mention cases of guards succumbing to exhaustion, sleepwalking, or succumbing to anxiety, often with deadly consequences. The human mind, deprived of stimulation yet forced into constant alertness, became as formidable an enemy as any invading force. Sleep deprivation was an unavoidable reality. Guards worked in shifts, but often understaffed castles required long hours on duty. Exhaustion slowed reflexes, dulled perception, and increased the likelihood of mistakes. Those who could not endure were reassigned, disciplined, or, in extreme cases, punished. Survival depended on finding ways to remain alert, packing the battlements, rubbing hands to ward off the cold, whispering to a comrade, or focusing on minute details like the movement of leaves, the distant sound of hoofbeats, or the reflections in a pool of moat water. In these moments, life and death hinged not on strength or courage, but on observation and mental acuity. Personal stories reveal the human toll of these conditions. A chronicler of the siege of Rochester Castle recounts a young guard who fainted during a long night of observation, waking to the distant sounds of battle already underway. He survived, but his comrades' quick actions highlight the constant interdependence among watchers. Survival was rarely an individual achievement. Another account from a miner, Norman Keep, describes a guard who, while on watch, noticed a subtle change in the pattern of moonlight on the battlements, a clue that an intruder had slipped past the outer defenses. His vigilance saved the castle from surprise entry, a reminder that the smallest acts of attention could have outsized consequences. The physical hazards of guarding the night were as severe as the psychological ones. Damp stone floors became slick with condensation, stairs were treacherously narrow, and the wind at high elevations could throw a guard off balance. Armor added weight, and torches provided limited light while also presenting the risk of fire or smoke inhalation. Even routine inspections could turn deadly. One misstep on a parapet could result in a fall into the moat, a tumble downstairs, or a fatal collision with a weapon rack. Guards had to develop not only vigilance but also physical coordination and agility, training themselves to move in ways that minimized risk while maximizing observation. Hunger and cold further compounded the challenges. Medieval castles were not heated beyond fireplaces, and stone walls radiated chill. Guards on high towers felt the wind most acutely, their extremities numb with cold. Meals were often delayed or rationed, sometimes eaten hastily while standing watch. Chroniclers describe soldiers using stolen moments of warmth, huddling near small braziers or sharing body heat with a comrade, creating brief islands of comfort amidst the constant tension. These small coping strategies were crucial, allowing guards to endure through the night without succumbing to the physical or mental strain. Communication among guards was vital. Medieval castles lacked modern signaling technology, so subtle cues were developed to convey messages across distances. A change in torch flame, a knock on stone, or a whistle could indicate a potential threat, signal reinforcement, or coordinate the operation of defensive mechanisms. Guards had to memorize these codes, trust their colleagues to act correctly, and maintain composure even when signals were ambiguous. Misinterpretation could be disastrous, making collaboration a central component of survival in the silent night. Despite these hardships, the role of a castle guard offered unexpected rewards. Guards developed acute awareness, strategic thinking, and the ability to endure extreme conditions, skills that were highly valued in both military and civic contexts. Loyalty, courage, and attention to detail were recognized by lords and commanders, leading to advancement within the hierarchy. In some cases, guards became indispensable advisors, their knowledge of the castle's defenses and terrain critical to broader military campaigns. Yet, for every advancement, countless guards suffered quietly, their experiences recorded only in passing mentions in chronicles or lost entirely to time. The Silent Watchers also played a critical psychological role for the castle's inhabitants. Their presence, even when unseen, reassured the residents that threats were monitored and that defenses were maintained. The tension that guards endured was, in a sense, transferred outward. Vigilance behind the walls allowed daily life within the keep to continue, whether it was cooking, cleaning, or conducting trade. The guards' endurance transformed the castle from a static structure into a living organism, where human attention and effort turned stone and timber into a formidable defensive network. Yet even the most vigilant guard faced uncertainty. The night could stretch for hours without incident, lulling even the most experienced into subtle complacency. And then, a noise, a rustle, a splash, a faint metallic clink could instantly awaken every instinct honed over months of observation. The combination of monotony and sudden terror defined the life of a watchman. Survival depended not only on skill and endurance, but also on the capacity to remain calm under relentless pressure, to read the environment accurately, and to act decisively in the face of the unknown. As you imagine standing in a dark turret, the wind cutting across your face, the moat glinting dimly below, and the castle sleeping in uneasy silence behind you, one thought lingers. How did these silent watchers endure year after year, night after night, performing acts of vigilance that were rarely recorded, rarely celebrated, yet essential to the survival of the castle itself? Their story is one of quiet heroism, of ordinary humans confronting fear, monotony, and danger in ways both extraordinary and deeply human. Dawn breaks slowly over the castle walls, spilling pale light across the battlements. The night has passed without an attack, and yet the guards do not relax. There is little celebration in surviving another night. For them, vigilance is endless, a cycle of monotony punctuated by brief, intense moments of potential disaster. The castle, now bathed in morning light, seems peaceful, but every shadow, every stone, and every creaking timber still carries memory of the night's invisible dangers. For centuries, castle guards have occupied this paradoxical space, guardians of safety, prisoners of duty. Their work is invisible to most, yet it shapes the very survival of the castle and its inhabitants. Guards witness the slow rhythms of life inside the keep, the movement of servants, the preparation of meals, the quiet activities of the lord and his family while remaining poised on the edge of danger. They are ever present yet unseen, living in a liminal world between action and anticipation. Historical accounts illustrate the extreme endurance required. During prolonged sieges, guards often went days without adequate rest or food, yet remained the first line of defense. Chroniclers describe soldiers perched atop battlements through freezing nights, their fingers numb around bowstrings, their eyes scanning for the faintest hint of movement. The psychological burden was as lethal as any arrow. Stories recount guards who developed rituals to stay awake, reciting prayers, counting stones in the walls, or humming quietly to themselves tiny acts of resistance against the overwhelming fatigue and fear. The human cost was immense. Many guards succumbed not to the enemy but to the environment and the stress of constant vigilance. Fatigue, exposure to cold and damp, and malnutrition often led to illness or accidental death. Falling from walls, slipping on icy parapets, or tripping in narrow staircases claimed as many lives as sieges themselves. Yet those who endured gained an unparalleled mastery of observation, discipline, and resilience, skills that were passed down, often informally, to the next generation of watchmen. Survival depended not only on physical prowess, but also on mental fortitude, adaptability, and an intimate understanding of the castle's architecture and hidden dangers. The strategic importance of guards extended beyond the battlements. Lords relied on their experience to detect weaknesses in walls, anticipate enemy movements, and coordinate defensive responses. In some castles, senior watchmen became trusted advisors, their knowledge informing the placement of reinforcements, the timing of counterattacks, or the organization of supply lines. The lessons learned from prolonged vigilance shaped not only defensive architecture, but also broader military strategy, reinforcing the notion that ordinary humans, through patience, skill, and endurance, could influence the outcomes of conflicts and protect entire communities. Yet the life of a guard was as isolating as it was vital. Many lived in small rooms adjacent to towers or in cramped quarters near the walls, often separated from family and social interaction. Comradeship among guards was essential for morale and effectiveness, but bonds were fragile, forged in shared hardship and reinforced by mutual reliance. Death was a constant companion, whether from accidents, disease, or combat. This created a culture of quiet stoicism. Guards learned to endure fear and loss without outward complaint, their sacrifices largely unrecorded and often forgotten. Despite the harshness, the role of a castle guard was central to the survival of medieval society. Guards preserved the safety of those within the keep, ensured the functionality of fortifications, and maintained the delicate equilibrium between defense and vulnerability. They embodied a paradox: ordinary individuals performing extraordinary work, shaping history through perseverance rather than spectacle. Each patrol, each careful observation, each calculated decision had consequences far beyond the immediate moment, influencing the course of sieges, the survival of families, and the stability of regions. The night also shaped human psychology in profound ways. Chroniclers note that long-serving guards developed an acute awareness of environmental cues, subtle changes in wind direction, distant animal movements, shifts in shadow across stone, even faint echoes that might indicate movement beyond walls. These skills were honed over years of repetition and danger, illustrating the intersection of human perception and survival. The castle became both a teacher and a challenge, offering lessons in observation, anticipation, and patience that extended far beyond military necessity. In reflection, the Silent Watchers remind us that the most important battles of history were not always fought on open fields. Many were fought in darkness, in the quiet tension of stone towers, where ordinary humans confronted fatigue, fear, and the constant possibility of death. Their endurance allowed castles to serve as centers of power, commerce, and social stability. Through vigilance, they protected lives, preserved order, and created the conditions for broader historical events to unfold. As you imagine standing on a battlement at midnight, the wind cutting across your face, your eyes scanning the moonlit landscape for threats both real and imagined, consider the paradox. The castle, a monument of stone and timber, is only as strong as the humans within it. The Silent Watchers endured, adapted, and persevered, yet their stories are mostly untold. How many lives were saved by eyes that never closed, ears that never rested, and hands that never faltered? And in the modern world, when we think of security, surveillance, and vigilance, how much of our understanding owes itself to these quiet, tireless guardians of the past? Story 3: The Dungeons Below, a history of medieval prison life. Imagine being led down a narrow spiral staircase, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The smell of mold and stagnant water becomes stronger, mixed with the acrid tang of unwashed bodies. You reach the bottom, and the last glimmer of daylight vanishes behind a heavy, iron-studded door. You are in a medieval dungeon, a place designed not merely to contain, but to break both body and spirit. Unlike the dramatic depictions of torture in movies, life here is defined by monotony, deprivation, and the slow erosion of hope. Dungeons were not uniform. Their design varied from castle to castle. Some were mere chambers beneath the keep, dark and cold, with rough-hewn stone floors and walls that dripped water from cracks above. Others were deep pits, carved into bedrock, accessible only by ladders or hidden doors. Some held prisoners in solitary confinement, others were crowded with dozens, where disease and filth spread quickly. In every case, the underlying purpose was the same: to isolate, to control, and to render prisoners vulnerable psychologically, physically, and socially. Life in these dungeons was a matter of survival. Food was scarce and often inedible, typically bread that had molded or meat that had long spoiled. Water, when provided, was frequently contaminated with debris or algae from nearby moats or cisterns. Prisoners had to stretch rations over days or even weeks, improvising with whatever scraps they could find. Hunger gnawed constantly, weakening the body, dulling the mind, and exacerbating despair. Chroniclers describe men and women surviving on little more than stale bread and the occasional cup of thin gruel, enduring conditions that would quickly incapacitate anyone accustomed to even modest comfort. The physical environment compounded the suffering. Stone walls absorbed moisture, making the air perpetually damp. Floors were uneven, often slick with waste or water, leading to injuries from slips and falls. In some castles, prisoners were chained to walls or iron rings embedded in stone, further restricting movement and creating sores and abrasions that became infected. Cold winters were particularly brutal, as heat was non-existent, and prisoners had little clothing or bedding to protect against frostbite and hypothermia. Summer brought its own hazards: stifling heat, swarms of insects, and the stench of overcrowded chambers where disease could flourish. Social dynamics within the dungeon were complex. While some prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, many were grouped together, often without regard for rank, crime, or temperament. This forced coexistence created tensions, sometimes erupting into violence. Chroniclers recount fights over scraps of food, disputes over sleeping arrangements, and even collective resistance against guards. Yet prisoners also formed fragile alliances, sharing small portions of food, teaching each other survival strategies, and providing comfort in whispered conversations. These interactions, though fleeting, were often the difference between life and death. Disease was a constant, invisible threat. Dungeons became breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and other parasites. Dysentery, cholera, and other infections spread rapidly in confined, unsanitary conditions. Many prisoners succumbed not to execution or torture, but to the slow attrition of illness. The lack of ventilation, combined with the accumulation of human waste and decaying food, made the air almost unbreathable in some chambers. Guards were well aware of these dangers but often ignored them, using them as an additional layer of punishment. Surviving required ingenuity. Prisoners collected rainwater, fashioned makeshift beds from straw or rags, and developed routines to ration energy and maintain alertness in the darkness. Despite the harshness, dungeons were rarely silent. The echoes of chains clinking, doors opening, and guards' footsteps carried through the stone corridors. Prisoners cried out in fear, despair, or pain, their voices bouncing off the walls in a haunting chorus. Some spoke in whispers to share information or comfort. Others remained silent, conserving energy and avoiding attention. The dungeon was both a physical and psychological trap, where the ordinary rhythms of life were suspended, replaced by constant vigilance and tension. Punishment in dungeons extended beyond mere confinement. Guards and jailers often inflicted additional suffering through deprivation, intimidation, or exposure. Chroniclers recount prisoners being left in complete darkness for days, forced to lie in waterlogged cells, or exposed to cold winds through small openings. Psychological torment was common. Uncertainty about the duration of imprisonment, rumors of execution, or the threat of torture created unrelenting stress. These methods, while subtle compared to formal execution, were profoundly effective in breaking the spirit and enforcing obedience. Yet not all prisoners were alike. Nobles or high-ranking captives might receive better treatment, more food, softer bedding, or access to attendants reflecting the rigid social hierarchies of the time. Commoners, rebels, or captured soldiers often faced the harshest conditions, illustrating the intersection of power, class, and cruelty in medieval incarceration. Even small privileges, like extra bread or access to a bucket for sanitation, became crucial for survival and a point of leverage within the social microcosm of the dungeon. Time passed slowly in these chambers. Days blended into weeks and weeks into months. Without clocks, light, or routine, prisoners lost track of temporal reality. Some documented the passing days by scratching marks into stone walls. Others relied on memory, counting meals or observing subtle environmental cues. The monotony itself became a form of torment, eroding mental resilience and leaving prisoners susceptible to despair, depression, or delusion. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on psychological adaptability. Learning to focus on small tasks, finding patterns in the environment, or maintaining hope against overwhelming odds. Even in the worst conditions, ingenuity emerged. Chroniclers report prisoners who escaped by exploiting weaknesses in the walls, bribing guards, or fashioning tools from scraps of metal. These acts were rare, risky, and often fatal if discovered, yet they demonstrate the persistent human drive to resist confinement, to assert agency, and to survive even in environments meticulously designed to suppress both. As you imagine standing in the darkness of a medieval dungeon, surrounded by cold stone, filth, and silence, one question lingers. What would it take to endure such isolation, hunger, and fear for days, weeks, or months at a time? How did ordinary humans find the strength to survive when the world above was almost entirely cut off, leaving only shadows, stone, and the constant threat of despair? The dungeon, in its grim design, asks us to consider the fragility and resilience of the human spirit, and the hidden costs of survival in a world built to break it. As the first weeks of imprisonment stretch into months, the dungeon reveals its true nature not as a simple holding cell, but as a slowly suffocating ecosystem of despair, resilience, and human ingenuity. Every day is a negotiation between survival and surrender. You learn quickly that in this dark, damp world, knowledge of the environment is as important as physical strength. Every stone, crack, and shadow may conceal either danger or opportunity, and mastering this confined space becomes essential for enduring its horrors. Water is among the first challenges. In many dungeons, supplies are minimal or unreliable. Rainwater may seep through cracks in the ceiling, collecting in puddles that are half stagnant, half filthy. The moat or castle cisterns may offer limited relief, but access is often controlled by guards or designed to be inconvenient. Prisoners develop tactics to make water last longer, storing it in hollowed wood, pottery shards, or even carved stone depressions, and rationing becomes a daily act of both necessity and strategy. Dehydration is slow but brutal, sapping strength, clouding judgment, and amplifying the mental strain imposed by the dungeon's darkness. Food, too, is scarce and often inedible. Daily rations might consist of stale bread, thin gruel, or leftover scraps deemed unfit for the castle's inhabitants. Sometimes, guards deliberately reduce portions to punish prisoners or force compliance. Resourcefulness becomes a survival skill. Prisoners share meager portions, barter scraps of cloth or personal possessions for extra morsels, or attempt to forage in small ways when permitted near the surface. Malnutrition weakens the body, but it also forces ingenuity, fostering subtle forms of resistance within the rigid hierarchy of captivity. Social dynamics play a profound role in survival. In overcrowded dungeons, prisoners must navigate a delicate network of alliances, hierarchies, and tensions. A stronger prisoner may assert control over food distribution or sleeping space, while smaller or weaker individuals learn to negotiate, submit, or hide to avoid conflict. Stories from 13th century English dungeons recount violent clashes over even the smallest resources: bread, scraps of clothing, or access to a dry corner. Yet cooperation also emerges, especially among those facing shared danger. Groups form, trading information about guards, routines, identifying safe spaces, or devising plans to communicate with the outside world. These fragile alliances illustrate the persistence of human ingenuity even under the harshest constraints. Hygiene, or the near-total lack of it, adds another layer of difficulty. Without proper sanitation, disease spreads quickly, exacerbating the already dire conditions. Lice, fleas, and vermin infest both the floors and walls, while stagnant water fosters dysentery and other infections. Guards rarely intervene unless illness threatens to escape the dungeon and affect the rest of the castle. Prisoners develop methods to cope, using scraps of cloth to cover sores, improvising cleaning rituals, or carefully choosing sleeping areas to minimize contact with vermin. Even these small acts require energy, ingenuity, and determination, turning survival into a daily strategy rather than a passive endurance. Mental resilience is as crucial as physical strength. Time in a dungeon distorts perception, making hours feel like days and days like months. Prisoners cope through repetitive routines, counting cracks in the walls, packing small areas, or mentally rehearsing past experiences. Some carve marks or symbols into the stone, both to track time and to leave a trace of existence in a place designed to erase individuality. Others engage in whispered conversations, storytelling, or silent prayers, subtle acts that maintain a sense of self and stave off despair. Chroniclers of the Tower of London, for instance, describe prisoners who survived long incarcerations by focusing on daily routines, maintaining small rituals, and cultivating mental strategies to remain oriented in the oppressive darkness. The dungeon's architecture itself shapes survival strategies. Cells were often designed to limit movement, reduce comfort, and maximize psychological pressure. Iron rings embedded in walls could chain prisoners for extended periods. Narrow shafts brought in light or air, but inconsistently, making orientation difficult. Deep pits or stone floors that absorbed moisture created cold, damp sleeping areas. Prisoners learned to exploit these features subtly, choosing corners that remained slightly drier, identifying stones that might provide leverage for movement, or using shadows to hide from guards' eyes. Adaptation became second nature, with survival depending on careful observation, patience, and constant innovation. Even the slightest interaction with guards could be pivotal. Some were cruel, others indifferent, and a few occasionally sympathetic. Bribes, favors, or the exchange of small information could secure slightly better treatment, extra food, or the chance to stand in sunlight briefly. Such opportunities were rare, and risky misjudgment could result in punishment or solitary confinement, but prisoners quickly learned the social nuances of the dungeon hierarchy. Success often depended on timing, perception, and the ability to remain calm under pressure, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of human behavior forged in adversity. Escape, though rare, was always considered. Prisoners studied the routines of guards, the weaknesses in doors or walls, and the patterns of sound in the dungeon corridors. Some managed to fashion rudimentary tools from scraps of metal or wood. Others took advantage of negligence or chaos during sieges, slipping past watchful eyes and scaling walls under cover of night. These successful escapes were exceptional, celebrated in chronicles, and often became legendary, illustrating not only the ingenuity required to survive, but the limits of even the most oppressive confinement. Time in the dungeon leaves its mark. Chroniclers note that prisoners who survived long periods of incarceration often emerged physically weakened, but mentally sharpened in certain ways, attuned to subtle cues, patient under stress, and resourceful in navigating human behavior and environmental challenges. These traits, forged in darkness and deprivation, were rare among ordinary civilians or soldiers, highlighting how extreme conditions can create unexpected forms of resilience. As you imagine sitting in a stone cell, the air thick and damp, rats scuttling across the floor, the faint sound of footsteps above, and the unrelenting echo of dripping water, you begin to understand the subtle horror of the dungeon. Survival here is not about dramatic confrontations or daring heroics, it is about endurance, observation, and the careful negotiation of physical, psychological, and social challenges. And yet, even in this oppressive darkness, one question lingers. How many prisoners endured weeks, months, or years of confinement, surviving through sheer mental and physical ingenuity, only to emerge into a world they had almost entirely lost touch with? The dungeon is not merely a site of punishment, it is a crucible of human resilience, testing the limits of survival in ways that ordinary history often overlooks. Time in the dungeon is measured not by clocks or sunlight, but by the slow erosion of the body and mind. Months, sometimes years, pass in darkness, damp, and isolation. For those who survive, the experience is transformative, an endurance test that leaves permanent marks on the body, sharpens mental resilience, and teaches lessons in observation, patience, and adaptability that few other experiences could impart. Yet escape from this crucible is only the beginning of another challenge: reintegration into a world that has moved on without them. The first step in survival is simply enduring. Prisoners who adapt to the dungeon's environment often find that small routines are critical. Rationing food and water, packing cells to maintain circulation, and developing mental exercises to stave off despair are essential strategies. Those who fail to maintain these habits succumb quickly to disease, hypothermia, malnutrition, or psychological collapse. Chroniclers from castles across medieval Europe, such as the Tower of London, Shadow Gaylord, and Rochester Castle, describe prisoners who survived by observing minute environmental details. Damp spots in the stone to collect water, slight weaknesses in door hinges, or the timing of guard patrols. Knowledge and attentiveness become tools of survival. Solitary confinement, often imposed for punishment or high-profile prisoners, presented unique psychological challenges. The absence of social interaction intensifies the sense of isolation, creating mental hazards as severe as physical ones. Prisoners cope by constructing imaginary routines, engaging in prayer, or speaking aloud to themselves to maintain a sense of temporal and personal continuity. In some cases, guards observed prisoners talking to themselves or carving symbols into the walls, acts of both survival and silent resistance. These small, deliberate behaviors were ways to assert control over an environment designed to strip them of agency. Disease, the silent killer, shaped daily life in the dungeon. Contagion spread quickly, often unchecked, due to overcrowding, poor ventilation, and vermin. Dysentery, scurvy, and respiratory illnesses were common, claiming as many lives as any executioner. Guards rarely intervened, using neglect as an additional layer of punishment. Yet prisoners learned adaptation through observation and experience, avoiding contaminated areas, sharing limited food strategically, and using improvised hygiene techniques whenever possible. In this environment, subtlety, patience, and careful observation were often more effective than physical strength. Interactions with other prisoners were a delicate dance. Alliances formed not just for survival, but for protection and information. High-status prisoners might barter privileges for food or guidance. Commoners relied on cooperation to avoid violence or to collectively manipulate guards for minor benefits. The dungeon became a microcosm of medieval society itself, with hierarchies, power struggles, and subtle negotiations shaping daily survival. Yet tension was constant. One misstep, one disagreement, could lead to injury or death. The social dynamics were as much a part of the dungeon's challenge as the physical deprivation. Those who survived long incarcerations often displayed remarkable ingenuity. Escapes, though rare, highlight the persistence of human resourcefulness. Chroniclers recount prisoners who fashioned tools from scraps of metal, bribed inattentive guards, or exploited architectural weaknesses. Some used nights of storm to mask movement or slipped out during distractions caused by external events like attacks or inspections. These escapes were dangerous and frequently fatal if discovered, yet they demonstrate a persistent human drive to reclaim autonomy and defy confinement, even in the harshest circumstances. Emerging from a dungeon into the light of day was a disorienting and often traumatic experience. Prisoners had to reacclimate to sunlight, fresh air, and the broader world outside the stone walls. Physical recovery might take weeks or months, but the psychological scars were deeper. Chroniclers describe former prisoners as cautious, hyper-alert, and deeply aware of risk traits honed by prolonged exposure to the subtle dangers of dungeon life. They were survivors not merely of confinement, but of an environment designed to break the human spirit, demonstrating resilience that few outside these walls could comprehend. The broader impact of dungeons on medieval society should not be underestimated. They were tools of justice, deterrence, and political control, shaping behavior both inside and outside the castle walls. The fear of being imprisoned in dark, damp, and cruel conditions influenced obedience, negotiation, and the enforcement of authority. Yet, in doing so, dungeons also created spaces in which ordinary humans developed extraordinary endurance, ingenuity, and psychological strength. The prisoners' survival became a testament to resilience under extreme adversity, a counterpoint to the cruelty and oppression imposed upon them. Finally, as you picture the darkness of a dungeon, the sound of dripping water echoing off stone walls, the faint scurrying of rats, and the stillness punctuated by occasional whispers or groans, one thought lingers. These spaces, designed to suppress humanity, also illuminate it. Within the gloom, ordinary individuals endured, adapted, and resisted. The dungeon becomes not just a site of punishment, but a silent teacher of resilience, observation, and ingenuity. How many lives, skills, and survival strategies were forged in these shadows, leaving echoes that subtly influenced the medieval world above? The answer remains hidden in the silent stone, waiting for us to recognize the endurance of those who survived. Story 4. Siege Engines and Endless Waiting. The Art of Medieval Starvation Warfare. In the shadow of a castle's towering walls, armies gather like clouds before a storm. The siege is not a battle of sudden clashes, but a slow, grinding test of endurance, patience, and ingenuity. You, as part of the besieging force, find yourself surrounded by wood, rope, and iron, the building blocks of engines designed to breach walls, crush gates, and terrorize defenders. Yet these devices, intricate and terrifying as they are only part of the story. The real art of siege warfare lies in the patience required to starve, wait, and manipulate the defenders until they break. Siege engines were marvels of medieval engineering. Trebuchets, with their massive counterweights and swinging arms, could hurl stones the size of small wagons over castle walls. Mangonels relied on twisted ropes to fling projectiles with terrifying velocity. Ballistae, essentially enormous crossbows, launched heavy bolts to pierce gates and walls. The construction and operation of these machines required skilled labor, precise calculations, and coordination among dozens of workers. Even minor miscalculations could result in catastrophic failure. A broken rope could release a counterweight too soon, injuring operators. Misaligned aim could send a projectile into your own camp. Every stone thrown was both a tool of destruction and a demonstration of human precision under pressure. Despite the spectacle of machines, most of a siege was marked by monotony. Days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, as attackers waited for defenders to weaken. Soldiers maintained encampments, repaired equipment, and foraged for food, all while remaining vigilant against sorties, night attacks, or counter-sabotage. Boredom, fatigue, and the relentless uncertainty of progress created a psychological battlefield as grueling as the physical one. Troops developed routines to maintain readiness, training drills, maintenance of engines, and quiet observation of the walls for weaknesses or unusual activity. Even the slightest insight, a loose stone, a rusted hinge, a gap in the defensive patrol could become a critical advantage in the long, slow struggle. Defenders, meanwhile, were equally engaged in endurance warfare. Behind the walls, the castle's inhabitants rationed food, conserved water, and maintained morale while facing constant threats. Gates were reinforced, towers repaired, and patrols adjusted to anticipate siege tactics. Chroniclers describe the psychological tension of these periods: the constant thrum of trebuchets, the threat of fire, the fear of disease spreading in overcrowded conditions. Every day became a negotiation of risk, a careful assessment of resources, and a test of human resilience. Siege warfare was as much about logistics as it was about engineering. Armies had to ensure steady supplies of wood, rope, metal, and stone for their engines, as well as food for thousands of soldiers. Supply lines were vulnerable to attack, theft, or natural obstacles. Shortages could halt progress, forcing the besieging army to either wait longer or improvise. In some cases, armies dug trenches, constructed fortifications, or diverted water to control the surrounding terrain, all of which demanded labor, ingenuity, and relentless attention to detail. The siege was, above all, a war of endurance, a slow chess match played with human bodies, stone, and time. The human experience of a siege was deeply psychological. Soldiers on both sides faced uncertainty, monotony, and fatigue. Guards atop walls feared hidden sappers or night raids. Attackers feared sudden sallies or misfires of their engines. Fatigue dulled reflexes, hunger sharpened desperation, and the slow passage of time eroded morale. Chroniclers often emphasize that the deadliest moments were not the initial attacks, but the ongoing tension, the exhaustion of waiting, and the constant vigilance that defined life during a prolonged siege. Starvation was the ultimate weapon. Sieges were rarely won through sheer firepower alone. Most successful campaigns relied on cutting off supplies, isolating the castle, and forcing surrender through attrition. Defenders calculated how long their food and water would last, sometimes keeping secret reserves in hidden caches. Attackers, in turn, monitored provisions, intercepted supply runs, and maintained pressure to prevent any escape. The tension between rationing, monitoring, and constant observation created a unique kind of psychological warfare, one in which time itself became a weapon. Even the smallest details mattered. Guards might watch for unusual smoke from chimneys, signaling cooking beyond rations. Attackers could probe walls with poles to test for hidden weaknesses. Engineers measured distances with crude but effective tools to optimize trebuchet trajectories. Every observation, every adjustment, and every small innovation had the potential to shift the balance. Siege warfare was as much an exercise in patience, calculation, and human endurance as it was in brute force or technical skill. Weather also played a role, often dictating the pace and outcome of a siege. Rain could render trenches impassable, moats overflow, or siege engines inoperable. Heat drained men and horses alike, while wind could alter the flight of stones or fire projectiles. Armies had to adapt continuously, improvising shelters, reinforcing engines, and rationing food and water in response to environmental challenges. The siege was thus not only a test of human skill, but of adaptability to forces beyond anyone's control. Chroniclers often emphasize the subtle tension in this slow warfare, the alternating periods of calm and terror, the long stretches of waiting punctuated by sudden, intense activity. Soldiers endured the monotony by maintaining routines, telling stories, or developing rituals to ward off fear and despair. Guards counted stones, repaired walls, inspected ropes, and listened intently to every sound both above and below. Observation, patience, and coordination became survival tools, highlighting the mental as much as the physical dimensions of siege warfare. As you imagine standing in the mud and smoke of a siege camp, listening to the groan of trebuchets and the occasional clang of a gate being tested, you begin to understand the peculiar horror of medieval sieges. The real enemy is not always swords or fire, but time itself. The days stretch endlessly, hunger gnaws at the body, and every stone hurled or wall reinforced is a reminder of the slow, inexorable struggle for survival. And in this context, one question arises: how did men, women, and even animals endure such prolonged tension, monotony, and deprivation, knowing that the outcome could hinge on a single miscalculation, a single failing in endurance? The days stretch on endlessly, each blending into the next with the same rhythm: the quiet creak of siege engines being tested, the low murmur of soldiers adjusting ropes and pulleys, and the distant, ever-present hum of tension from behind castle walls. Here, in the mud and dust of the encampment, the siege becomes as much a mental struggle as a physical one. Every man and woman, soldier and laborer, must endure the slow erosion of hope while maintaining vigilance, coordination, and ingenuity. Endurance is perhaps the most critical skill in siege warfare. Soldiers and engineers face long shifts constructing and repairing engines, monitoring walls and managing supplies, often in harsh weather with minimal comfort. Rain turns trenches into mud pits, frost makes wooden wheels brittle, and heat saps energy during long hours of labor. Physical resilience is essential, but mental stamina is equally vital. The monotony of waiting, punctuated by sudden bursts of danger such as an arrow fired from the battlements or a defensive sortie, requires soldiers to remain focused and disciplined for weeks or months at a time. Siege engines, for all their destructive potential, demand constant maintenance. Trebuchets with their massive counterweights must be carefully balanced and lubricated. Ropes can fray, axles can splinter, and even a slight misalignment can render an entire machine useless. Engineers and laborers spend hours testing mechanisms, adjusting angles, and repairing damage caused by weather or repeated use. Each adjustment requires knowledge, precision, and coordination. A poorly maintained engine could harm the operators as easily as the defenders, turning the tools of conquest into instruments of catastrophe. The human stories within a siege are as compelling as the mechanics. Soldiers endure extreme fatigue, hunger, and fear. Chroniclers recount individuals fainting from exhaustion, freezing on night watch, or falling ill from contaminated food and water. Yet these same individuals often display remarkable ingenuity, improvising makeshift shelters, scavenging materials for repairs, or devising clever methods to conserve energy and resources. Survival depends on subtle observation, collaboration, and creativity, as much as on courage or strength. Food scarcity is a relentless pressure on both attackers and defenders. Encampments rely on supply lines, which can be disrupted by weather, enemy action, or logistical miscalculations. Soldiers ration food carefully, often eating the same meager portions day after day. For defenders, the threat of starvation is even more acute. They calculate how long their reserves will last, hide secret caches, and sometimes attempt daring foraging missions or supply runs under the cover of darkness. The slow depletion of resources becomes a psychological weapon. Both sides are constantly aware of the fragility of their situation, and the pressure builds incrementally over time. Communication and coordination define success in siege warfare. Attackers must coordinate engineers, archers, and infantry, timing assaults with the operation of engines and the movement of troops. Guards and sentries monitor the enemy, relaying information about weaknesses, movements, or counterattacks. On the defender's side, signals must be interpreted, reinforcements allocated, and patrols adjusted. Miscommunication can be deadly. A single misread signal or delayed response can allow attackers to exploit a vulnerability, breach a wall, or storm a gate. Both sides live in a constant state of tension, where attention to detail is as crucial as courage or physical strength. The siege also tests the adaptability of all involved. Weather can change plans instantly, Accidents can damage vital equipment, and unpredictable human behavior, panic, error, or defiance can shift outcomes. Soldiers must improvise, whether reinforcing walls with sandbags, repairing ropes with splints of wood, or constructing temporary shelters in rain-soaked trenches. Adaptation is not optional. It is essential for survival. The siege becomes a prolonged exercise in problem-solving under pressure, a test of both human ingenuity and endurance. Psychological warfare plays a subtle but critical role. The mere presence of engines on the horizon, the thump of trebuchet projectiles, or the prolonged siege of a castle is designed to weaken morale. Chroniclers note defenders packing nervously, counting rations obsessively, and experiencing heightened fear during the long, silent nights. Attackers, too, struggle with despair, witnessing days of preparation yield little progress. Victory is often won not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady accumulation of pressure, both physical and mental, until one side can no longer sustain the effort. Long-term strategies include manipulating water supplies, undermining walls, or threatening indirect routes to force the defender's hand. Siege engineers sometimes used psychological tools, launching dead animals over walls to spread disease or fear, sending threatening messages, or creating deceptive constructions to confuse observers. These methods were painstakingly calculated, emphasizing the slow, methodical nature of siege warfare. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to the gradual erosion of resistance. The human cost is profound. Soldiers labor under extreme conditions, often injured or sick, while maintaining the appearance of strength. Defenders confront hunger, fatigue, and the anxiety of impending doom. Chroniclers recount tales of despair, occasional heroism, and relentless patience. The siege is a test of endurance, patience, and ingenuity, a war fought as much in the mind as on the walls. As you imagine standing in a rain-soaked encampment, listening to the low groan of a trebuchet, the whispers of soldiers checking ropes, and the distant murmur of life behind castle walls, one truth becomes clear. Siege warfare is defined not by the moments of spectacular destruction, but by the slow accumulation of pressure, the relentless testing of patience, and the quiet ingenuity of ordinary humans confronting extreme adversity. And in this long, grinding conflict, one question emerges. How many men, women, and even animals endured weeks or months of constant tension, fatigue, and deprivation, sustaining hope and discipline long enough for the siege to reach its grim conclusion? The siege ends not with a single dramatic clash, but with subtle signs that wear down defenders, dwindling supplies, exhausted soldiers, and eroded morale. Some castles surrender without a fight, recognizing that time has become the most effective weapon. Others fall after months of attrition, when trebuchets have weakened walls, starvation has thinned the garrison, or desperation leads to errors. The culmination is rarely a heroic charge. It is patience, endurance, and observation, a prolonged contest of human resilience against human resilience. For the defenders, surrender is both relief and trauma. After months of rationing, sleepless nights, and constant anxiety, even small comforts, sunlight, fresh water, and edible food become profound luxuries. Chroniclers describe survivors emerging pale and gaunt, their minds sharpened by the constant attention to risk, their bodies weakened by hunger. Some captives were ransomed, others imprisoned further, but all carried the lasting psychological imprint of protracted deprivation. The experience shapes not only individuals, but the social and military structures that govern medieval life. Attackers, too, are transformed. Months spent building engines, maintaining encampments, and enduring harsh conditions demand ingenuity and endurance. Soldiers develop skills in engineering, logistics, and coordination that are rarely recognized but essential to success. The slow, methodical nature of siege warfare teaches lessons in patience and strategy, illustrating that human persistence more than brute force often determines outcomes. Even seemingly minor details, such as adjusting a trebuchet counterweight or observing enemy patterns can tip the balance of a campaign. Historical records reveal both the ingenuity and cruelty embedded in siege culture. Dead animals were sometimes catapulted over walls to spread disease or fear. Psychological manipulation, threats, misinformation, or the strategic display of power was employed to undermine morale. Attackers and defenders alike endured hunger, disease, and fatigue, learning the harsh truth that survival and victory often depended on managing small details over long stretches of time. The slow grind of siege warfare became a microcosm of human endurance, revealing the extraordinary capacities of ordinary individuals. The logistical challenges alone were monumental. Armies had to secure food, water, and fodder for horses, repair or replace engines damaged by weather or repeated use, and maintain discipline under relentless stress. Every delay or error could extend the siege by weeks or even months, turning a calculated plan into a test of endurance for everyone involved. Commanders relied not only on strategy but also on observation, foresight, and the ability to anticipate both human and environmental variables. Success was rarely instantaneous. It was earned through diligence, patience, and the tireless coordination of countless small actions. Yet even in the midst of deprivation and danger, human ingenuity shines. Soldiers constructed makeshift shelters to withstand rain, reinforced trebuchets with scavenged materials, and devised methods to ration food and water efficiently. Defenders improvised secret caches, reinforced weak walls, and conducted daring sorties to disrupt supply lines. The siege becomes a prolonged chess match, where observation, patience, and subtle innovation often outweigh strength or weaponry. Each day is a small test, and the accumulation of these days determines ultimate survival or defeat. The siege also highlights the human capacity for adaptation under stress. Soldiers and civilians alike develop acute awareness of environmental and human cues, shifts in wind direction that might affect trebuchet aim, subtle sounds indicating enemy activity, or patterns in ration distribution. These adaptations reflect both instinct and learned experience, demonstrating how extreme conditions shape perception, decision-making, and resilience. The siege is a crucible of human skill, endurance, and ingenuity, in which small actions carry outsized consequences. In reflection, siege warfare demonstrates the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary humans will go to survive and prevail. Castles did not fall solely to swords and fire. They fell to patience, meticulous planning, and the relentless human drive to endure. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians all contributed to outcomes through sustained effort, careful observation, and subtle innovation. The psychological and physical trials of siege life reveal the hidden costs of medieval warfare and the quiet heroism embedded in endurance itself. As you imagine standing in a rain-soaked camp outside castle walls, listening to the creak of trebuchets, the whispers of soldiers repairing ropes, and the distant murmur of life behind fortifications, one final truth emerges. Medieval sieges were less about dramatic triumphs and more about the extraordinary resilience of ordinary humans confronting time, deprivation, and uncertainty. How many lives were shaped, altered, or lost simply through patience, endurance, and observation? And in the centuries that followed, how did the lessons learned from these grueling contests inform strategies, fortifications, and human understanding of resilience itself? Story 5. The Hidden Lives of Medieval Blacksmiths, Forging More Than Weapons. Imagine stepping into a small, smoky workshop tucked behind the bustle of a medieval village. The air is thick with soot, sweat, and the metallic tang of heated iron. Sparks fly from the hammer as it strikes glowing metal, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pulse that echoes through the workshop. You are standing in the world of the medieval blacksmith, a space of intense labor, quiet ingenuity, and crucial importance to the functioning of both village life and castle defense. Blacksmiths were among the most essential artisans of their time. They produced tools, nails, horseshoes, and household implements, but their work also extended to the weapons and armor that defined the military power of a lord or kingdom. Their expertise shaped the capabilities of entire communities. A poorly forged plow could ruin crops, a fragile chain could collapse a drawbridge, and a weak sword could cost a life in battle. The blacksmith's forge, therefore, was a nexus of survival, economy, and power, where ordinary metals were transformed into instruments that influenced the course of daily life and war alike. The forge itself was both tool and environment. Charcoal fires burned steadily in a hearth, their heat carefully managed to reach temperatures sufficient for working iron and steel. Hammers, tongs, anvils, and chisels were extensions of the blacksmith's body, each requiring years of skill to wield effectively. Every strike had to be precise. Too hard and the metal could crack, too soft and it would fail under stress. Blacksmiths learned to read the glowing color of metal, judging its temperature and malleability by subtle shifts in hue from dull red to bright orange to molten yellow-white. The process demanded patience, precision, and a deep understanding of materials. Daily life in the forge was exhausting. Hours were spent in near-constant motion, lifting heavy metal, swinging hammers, and stoking fires. The heat and smoke took a toll on the body, leaving hands blistered, eyes watery, and lungs thick with soot. Blacksmiths often rose before dawn and worked until nightfall, interrupted only by essential tasks like fetching water or coal. Despite the physical strain, their work required meticulous attention to detail. A single mistake could ruin an entire batch of metal, wasting precious resources and jeopardizing livelihoods. Beyond technical skill, blacksmiths had to be problem solvers. Each project presented unique challenges: shaping a horseshoe to fit a specific horse, crafting a lock with intricate internal mechanisms, or forging a sword that balanced strength and flexibility. Knowledge of geometry, metallurgy, and mechanical principles, though not formalized as science at the time, was critical. Blacksmiths often experimented with different alloys, tempering methods, and hammering techniques, producing work that combined art, science, and practical necessity. Socially, blacksmiths occupied an intriguing position in medieval communities. They were respected for their skill and essential to the economy, yet their work was dangerous and dirty, distancing them from the relative comfort of merchants or clergy. Blacksmiths' workshops often served as informal gathering places. Farmers might come to repair tools, knights to sharpen weapons, and villagers to seek advice on iron-based solutions to practical problems. In this way, blacksmiths acted as hubs of knowledge, both technical and social, bridging the everyday needs of ordinary life with the strategic demands of defense and warfare. The life of a blacksmith was also governed by cycles of production dictated by seasonal and social needs. Spring and summer brought agricultural tools and horseshoes. Winter focused on repairs, sharpening, and weapon production for lords preparing for campaigns. Festivities, markets, and taxes further influenced workload, often requiring bursts of intensive labor to meet communal obligations. The blacksmith's schedule was a delicate balance of constant physical labor, precise craftsmanship, and responsiveness to social and military demands. Blacksmiths were not isolated technicians. Their work was deeply integrated into broader networks of medieval life. Collaboration with apprentices ensured the transfer of knowledge and skills, while trade with merchants provided essential materials like iron, coal, and specialized alloys. Nobles and military leaders relied on blacksmiths to maintain armories, repair siege equipment, and produce reliable weapons, often observing the work firsthand to ensure quality. A successful blacksmith was a linchpin of both local stability and military capability, a silent architect of survival and power. The forge itself became a theater of discipline and mastery. Apprentices learned through repetition, observation, and gradual exposure to danger, absorbing both practical techniques and subtle wisdom. Mistakes carried consequences. Burns, cuts, and injuries were common, teaching respect for the craft and the material. Over time, blacksmiths developed intuition for metal, fire, and motion, translating years of labor into instinctive skill. Each swing of the hammer, each shaping of metal, was a negotiation with forces both natural and human-made. Even in mundane tasks, blacksmiths influenced life and history. A poorly forged chain could fail during a siege, a shod horse could stumble at a critical moment, or a lock could prevent or allow theft. Their work was both visible and invisible. The daily labor of creation and repair underpinned larger events, from harvests to battles, yet often went unnoticed by the broader populace. In this sense, blacksmiths occupied a quiet, indispensable role in shaping the rhythm and outcomes of medieval society. As you picture standing in the heat and smoke of a medieval forge, the hammer striking glowing metal with steady rhythm, you begin to sense the extraordinary nature of these ordinary artisans. They were creators and problem solvers, technicians and innovators, sustaining their communities through labor that was both physically demanding and strategically crucial. And yet, one question lingers. How many lives, outcomes, and even battles were influenced by hands and hammers working tirelessly in the shadow of smoke and fire, crafting tools and weapons that were both mundane and decisive? As the forge settles into its steady rhythm, you begin to notice the smaller details that define a blacksmith's world. The subtle glow of metal at precise temperatures, the sound of hammer on anvil, and the carefully orchestrated movements of apprentices under a master's watchful eye. Blacksmithing was not a solitary craft. It relied on the transmission of knowledge through rigorous apprenticeship, demanding patience, observation, and endurance from both teacher and student. Apprenticeships could last 7 years or more, a period marked by hard labor, close supervision, and incremental learning. Apprentices began with menial tasks carrying coal, cleaning the hearth, or polishing metal before advancing to hammering, shaping, and eventually crafting functional tools and weapons. Mistakes were inevitable, but the dangers were very real. A slip of a hammer could result in burns, crushed fingers, or worse. The master blacksmith role was as much about safeguarding apprentices as instructing them, balancing patience with discipline to ensure the survival and skill of the next generation. Ingenuity was a constant requirement. Materials were not uniform, and the quality of iron could vary dramatically from shipment to shipment. A blacksmith might receive brittle iron, necessitating repeated heating and hammering to remove impurities, or soft iron that required tempering to hold a functional edge. Weapons demanded precise shaping to balance strength and flexibility. A misjudged curve in a sword blade could render it useless or dangerously brittle. Tools, armor, and household implements all carried hidden complexity that demanded careful observation, creative problem-solving, and iterative experimentation. Even the smallest innovations could have wide-reaching effects. For instance, a blacksmith who devised a stronger horseshoe could improve a horse's endurance, influencing travel, trade, and even military campaigns. A more efficient plowshare could increase crop yields, impacting food supply and community stability. Small improvements in lock mechanisms could prevent theft or secure valuables. Blacksmiths were, in many ways, invisible engineers of medieval life, their labor supporting both the mundane rhythms of villages and the strategic needs of kingdoms. The social dimension of the forge was equally important. Blacksmiths interacted with farmers, merchants, soldiers, and nobility, providing services that extended beyond mere metalwork. Advice on tools, repairs, or mechanical problems created networks of reliance and trust. Nobles often visited workshops to inspect weapons, offer commissions, or request specialized armor, giving blacksmiths a rare opportunity to influence outcomes far beyond the village. Through these interactions, the blacksmith's knowledge and skill quietly shaped social, economic, and military systems. Hazards were ever present. The forge was an environment of fire, molten metal, and heavy tools. Blacksmiths developed acute awareness of safety through experience, instinctively managing the risk of burns, sparks, and collapsing machinery. Chroniclers note that long-serving blacksmiths often exhibited remarkable physical endurance and agility, adapting their movements to the demands of the craft. Mental resilience was equally critical. Focus had to be maintained despite fatigue, distraction, and the pressures of urgent commissions. In this way, blacksmiths balanced creativity, labor, and danger in daily practice. Apprenticeship also carried the weight of tradition and reputation. The quality of a blacksmith's work reflected on the family, village, and sometimes even the lord or knight who commissioned it. A flawed weapon or tool could have consequences far beyond the workshop, from failed harvests to battlefield defeats. This pressure cultivated discipline, precision, and a culture of accountability rarely found in other medieval trades. Each strike of the hammer carried both practical and symbolic weight, bridging labor and legacy. The forge was also a center of adaptation. Blacksmiths responded to technological and social changes, such as the introduction of new alloys, evolving weapon designs, or changing agricultural practices. They experimented with crossbars, rivets, and tempering techniques, often without formal documentation, passing insights orally or through hands-on demonstration. This iterative knowledge transfer allowed for gradual improvements over generations, making the blacksmith's role not only reactive, but also innovative. Human endurance and resilience emerge in subtle ways. Long hours at the forge demanded constant attention, yet blacksmiths found rhythm and even meditative focus in repetition. Sparks flying from an anvil, the steady heartbeat of hammer on metal, and the tactile feedback of shaping iron all contributed to an almost immersive flow state. Apprentices absorbed these lessons, developing both technical skill and mental stamina, preparing them to continue the craft under harsh conditions. The influence of blacksmiths extended beyond their immediate work. Armies relied on their weapons and armor, villages depended on their tools, markets were sustained by their nails, hinges, and metal fittings. Even seemingly minor innovations could ripple outward. A stronger cart axle improved transport efficiency, a sharpened plowshare boosted harvest yields, and a reinforced gate increased the security of an entire community. Blacksmiths, often overlooked in historical narratives, were quietly shaping the infrastructure, defense, and economy of medieval life. As you imagine the steady pulse of hammer against anvil, the heat and smoke of the forge enveloping the workshop, one insight becomes clear. The medieval blacksmith was far more than a laborer. They were innovators, problem solvers, and essential nodes in a complex social and technological network. Their work shaped the survival, security, and prosperity of villages, castles, and kingdoms alike. And yet, one question lingers. How many pivotal events, successful battles, thriving harvests, or innovations in infrastructure depended on the quiet mastery of metal by hands that toiled unseen in the shadows of medieval life? The forge falls silent only when the day ends, leaving behind a lingering heat, the smell of coal, and the faint glow of cooled metal. Yet even in the quiet, the work of the blacksmith continues to echo through the lives of everyone who depends on it. From the simplest horseshoe to the most intricate sword, the blacksmith's creations influence movement, defense, and survival, shaping the medieval world in subtle but profound ways. Their legacy is not only in the objects they crafted, but in the networks, skills, and ingenuity they nurtured. A blacksmith's workshop was both a laboratory and a classroom. Apprentices trained under careful supervision, absorbing techniques, traditions, and problem-solving skills that would carry them through decades of labor. Over time, this transfer of knowledge ensured continuity in both craft and innovation. Techniques for tempering steel, forging hinges, or shaping blades evolved gradually, guided by observation, experimentation, and the shared wisdom of generations. Each apprentice who became a master carried forward not just metalwork skills, but a methodology of careful planning, patience, and adaptation. The blacksmith's impact extended far beyond the walls of the workshop. Armorers depended on their skill to produce functional protective gear. Farmers relied on their plows and tools. Merchants and tradespeople counted on their hardware and nails. Even architects and builders sought their expertise for gates, hinges, and structural reinforcements. The blacksmith's labor became an invisible backbone of daily life, enabling productivity, security, and resilience. Without these craftsmen, both the mundane and strategic operations of medieval society would falter. Military campaigns often turned on the quality of the blacksmith's work. A poorly tempered sword could snap in battle. A brittle arrowhead might fail to pierce armor. A weak horseshoe could disable a cavalry horse at a critical moment. Generals and lords relied on the skill and reliability of these artisans as much as on tactics or numbers. Every forge, tucked away in a village or castle town, contributed to the broader strategic framework of kingdoms, ensuring that armies were equipped, maintained, and capable of enduring the rigors of combat. Yet blacksmiths were not merely reactive technicians, they were innovators. By experimenting with alloys, refining hammering techniques, or devising new designs for weapons, tools, and structural supports, they advanced practical knowledge in ways often unrecorded. The medieval blacksmith was an unsung engineer, blending art and science with survival needs. Many of these incremental innovations rippled through society, enhancing productivity, improving defenses, and sometimes altering the outcomes of conflicts or economic stability. The physical toll of the forge was immense. Long hours spent near fires, lifting heavy metal, and working with precision tools left hands calloused, lungs thick with soot, and bodies worn. Injuries were common, from burns to crushed fingers. Yet these hardships fostered resilience and discipline. Apprentices learned to endure discomfort, master technique, and cultivate focus qualities essential for both survival in the workshop and effectiveness in their broader societal roles. The forge was thus a crucible not only for metal, but for character, skill, and endurance. The social dimension of blacksmithing also left a lasting mark. Workshops were hubs of communication, trade, and collaboration. Villagers brought problems, requested innovations, and exchanged ideas. Nobles and military leaders commissioned specialized work, creating connections that extended the influence of the blacksmith far beyond the workshop. These networks facilitated the spread of techniques, the sharing of knowledge, and the cultivation of reputation. A blacksmith's influence, though often invisible, was woven into the social, economic, and political fabric of medieval life. As you imagine the workshop in the late evening, the coals dimming and the rhythmic hammering finally ceasing, the significance of these artisans becomes clear. They were not merely makers of objects. They were architects of survival and progress, sustaining communities, armies, and economies through skill, ingenuity, and endurance. Their labor, though ordinary in its daily repetition, was extraordinary in its cumulative impact. And yet one thought lingers. How many pivotal events in history, the outcome of battles, the success of harvests, or the security of a village depended quietly on the hands of blacksmiths who worked unseen, day after day, shaping metal and shaping the course of medieval life. Their story reminds us that history is not only written in the deeds of kings and generals, but in the sparks, sweat, and skill of those who forged the tools that enabled survival itself. Story 6. Monastic medicine, healing and survival in medieval abbeys. Imagine walking through the cool stone corridors of a medieval abbey. The flickering light of candles casts long shadows across carved archways, and the faint scent of herbs and incense hangs in the air. Somewhere nearby, a monk carefully grinds dried plants into powders, or boils roots in water over a low fire. You are stepping into the world of monastic medicine, a place where healing was a blend of observation, ritual, and empirical knowledge, all conducted in quiet dedication behind the abbey walls. Monks and nuns were among the few literate members of medieval society, giving them access to manuscripts, herbal guides, and ancient medical texts. Their role as healers extended beyond the abbey walls. They treated the sick among the poor, advised travelers, and cared for injured soldiers. These monastic infirmaries were more than spiritual sanctuaries, they were critical nodes of survival, knowledge, and experimentation in a world where illness, malnutrition, and injury were constant threats. The monastic approach to medicine combined observation with tradition. Healing was rarely dramatic. Instead, monks focused on careful attention to symptoms, patient care, and incremental improvements. They recorded their observations meticulously, noting which herbs alleviated pain, which poultices reduced swelling, and which remedies were ineffective or dangerous. The work required patience, attentiveness, and humility. In an era without germ theory or modern diagnostics, survival often depended on careful trial, error, and meticulous record-keeping. Herbal remedies formed the backbone of monastic medicine. Leaves, roots, flowers, and barks were carefully harvested, dried, and stored, each with specific preparation methods. Chamomile, sage, and thyme were common. More exotic imports, such as myrrh or aloe, might appear in wealthier abbeys. Monks developed precise techniques for infusion, decoction, and poultice application, ensuring that each plant's medicinal properties were preserved as much as possible. Preparation required both physical dexterity and detailed knowledge, balancing the subtleties of chemistry with practical needs. Sanitation was another focus, often overlooked in popular accounts of medieval life. Monastic infirmaries implemented rudimentary hygiene practices, such as boiling instruments, washing hands, and segregating the sick to prevent cross-contamination. While far from modern standards, these practices helped reduce the spread of infectious diseases in closed communities. In a world where epidemics could decimate entire towns, such methods were life-saving, even if imperfect. Diet and nutrition were intertwined with healing. Monks understood that proper food, grains, legumes, and preserved fruits strengthened the body's resilience. In some abbeys, gardens were cultivated specifically to provide medicinal plants and nourishing ingredients. Fasting, common in religious practice, was carefully managed in the infirmary to avoid weakening patients further. These interventions demonstrate that monastic medicine extended beyond isolated treatments. It embraced lifestyle, environment, and prevention as critical components of health. Observation and recording were central to the monastic healer's craft. Illness was documented in logs, noting symptoms, progression, and responses to treatment. Some abbeys maintained extensive herbal manuals, copying and annotating texts from earlier Roman or Greek sources. Knowledge was cumulative, passed between generations of monks and shared among abbeys. Even simple remedies like willow bark for pain were preserved and transmitted because careful observation revealed their consistent efficacy. This systematic attention to detail laid the groundwork for later medical advances, even if it remained embedded in religious context. The human element was as vital as the medicinal. Monks and nuns provided not only physical remedies, but also comfort, reassurance, and spiritual guidance. Patients were treated with empathy, encouragement, and attention, factors that modern research confirms can influence outcomes even when medical interventions are limited. In a medieval abbey, the healer's role was holistic, tending to the body, nurturing the mind, and guiding the spirit, all within the austere rhythms of monastic life. Yet danger was ever present. Epidemics like smallpox, typhus, and plague could sweep through abbeys despite precautions. Injuries from accidents, construction, or military campaigns were common, and treatments were limited to what herbs, poultices, or rudimentary surgical procedures could offer. Monks had to balance experimentation with caution, knowing that errors could cost lives. The responsibility was immense. In these walls, the fate of patients rested on careful observation, knowledge, and endurance. Daily life in the infirmary was structured, disciplined, and repetitive. Morning prayers were followed by preparations for treatment, tending to the sick, and maintaining medicinal stores. Cleaning, grinding, boiling, and administering remedies were constant tasks, interspersed with study and reflection. The rhythm of care was unbroken, and the work was often physically taxing, mentally demanding, and emotionally draining. Yet for those who persevered, the abbey became a place of quiet mastery, where knowledge accumulated and human lives were preserved in small, incremental ways. As you imagine standing beside the infirmary's hearth, inhaling the mingled scents of herbs, soot, and candle wax, one truth emerges. Monastic medicine was not about dramatic cures or heroic interventions. It was about careful observation, incremental improvement, and patient endurance. The monks' labor saved countless lives through knowledge, empathy, and perseverance. And yet, one question lingers. How many medieval lives, ordinary, forgotten, or crucial to history, were prolonged, healed, or preserved through the quiet, methodical work of hands and minds committed to survival behind abbey walls? As the days pass within the abbey, the work of healing settles into a steady, almost invisible routine. The infirmary does not feel dramatic or urgent in the way a battlefield does. Instead, it is defined by repetition. The same prayers, the same careful measurements of herbs, the same slow observation of bodies as they weaken or recover. You begin to understand that medieval monastic medicine was not practiced in moments of crisis alone, but sustained through discipline, patience, and an acceptance that progress was often slow and uncertain. Monastic healers worked within strict schedules dictated by prayer, meals, and silence. Time was divided carefully, and medical care had to fit within these rhythms. Treatments were administered at specific hours, wounds cleaned methodically, and patients monitored with quiet attentiveness. This structure was not merely religious, it imposed consistency. In an era without clocks as we know them, routine became a tool of care. Patients were fed, washed, and treated regularly, which alone could mean the difference between recovery and decline. Yet behind this order lay constant uncertainty. Monks lacked any true understanding of infection, circulation, or internal disease. Diagnosis relied on observation, the color of urine, the warmth of skin, the rhythm of breathing, the smell of wounds. These signs were interpreted through a mix of inherited theory often derived from ancient Greek and Roman texts and practical experience. When treatments failed, monks recorded it. When something worked, they noted it carefully. Over time, this created a body of knowledge rooted not in certainty, but in cautious accumulation. One of the greatest challenges faced by monastic healers was balancing care with risk. Treating the sick meant exposure to disease, especially during outbreaks. Infirmarians often continued their work knowing they might fall ill themselves. Some monasteries attempted isolation measures, separating the most severe cases or restricting movement within the abbey. These decisions were difficult and imperfect, but they reflected an emerging understanding that illness could spread through proximity. Surgery, when required, was rudimentary and dangerous. Minor procedures draining abscesses, setting broken bones, cleaning deep wounds were performed with simple tools: knives, needles, and clamps heated in fire. Pain management relied on alcohol, herbal sedatives, or prayer. Blood loss and infection were constant threats. Monks approached such procedures with caution, often delaying intervention unless absolutely necessary. Survival frequently depended less on surgical skill than on post-treatment care, cleanliness, rest, and nutrition. Herbal experimentation carried its own risks. Dosage was difficult to control, and some plants straddled the line between medicine and poison. Foxglove, henbane, and mandrake were known for their powerful effects, but misuse could be fatal. Monastic texts frequently warned against overuse, emphasizing moderation and careful observation. Trial and error was unavoidable, but it was conducted slowly, cautiously, and with detailed records to prevent repeated mistakes. Mental and emotional care also played a significant role. The infirmary was a quiet space, shielded from the noise and labor of the outer world. Patients were spoken to gently, encouraged to rest, and reassured through prayer and conversation. Monks believed that despair weakened the body, while calm and faith supported recovery. Whether or not they understood the biology, they recognized the importance of environment and emotional stability in healing. The infirmary itself was often positioned to maximize light, warmth, and airflow. Windows were opened when weather allowed, bedding was changed regularly, and patients were kept elevated to avoid damp stone floors. These choices, though simple, reduced complications and discomfort. Even small details, clean straw, fresh water, warm broth, were considered essential elements of care. Knowledge did not remain isolated within a single abbey. Monks traveled, exchanged manuscripts, and corresponded with other religious houses. Successful treatments spread slowly across regions, copied by hand and adapted to local resources. In this way, monastic medicine formed a quiet network of shared experience. There were no breakthroughs in the modern sense, but there was continuity, a slow refinement of what worked and what did not. The emotional toll on healers was significant. Not every patient survived. Monks witnessed prolonged suffering, slow declines, and deaths they could not prevent. Yet they continued their work, guided by duty and belief rather than outcome. Healing was not defined by success alone, but by effort and presence. To remain with the sick, even when cure was impossible, was considered a form of service as vital as any remedy. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain wounds healed more reliably with specific treatments. Certain fevers responded better to rest and hydration than to aggressive intervention. These observations shaped practice, creating an informal but deeply experiential form of medical knowledge. It was not scientific by modern standards, but it was systematic in its own way, built on repetition, documentation, and humility. As you sit quietly in the infirmary, listening to the soft movements of monks tending patients and the faint sound of prayer drifting through stone corridors, it becomes clear that monastic medicine was never about certainty. It was about endurance in the face of ignorance, about care when outcomes were unknown, and about maintaining human dignity in an era of constant vulnerability. And this raises an unsettling question. When so much depended on patience, restraint, and quiet observation, how often did survival hinge not on a cure, but on the simple decision to wait, to watch, and to do no more than what could be safely done? In the final hours of the day, the abbey grows still. Candles burn low, footsteps soften, and the infirmary settles into a hush broken only by breathing, murmured prayers, and the occasional rustle of straw bedding. Healing here does not announce itself with triumph. It reveals itself slowly, often unnoticed. A fever that no longer rises, a wound that stops weeping, a patient who manages to sit upright after days of weakness. These small changes, barely remarkable on their own, were the true measures of success in monastic medicine. What monastic healers practiced was not cure in the modern sense, but care sustained over time. Their greatest contribution was not a single remedy or technique, but a system, one built on observation, repetition, documentation, and restraint. In a world where illness was common and death never distant, monasteries became places where suffering was met with order rather than chaos. This alone altered survival rates, even when treatments were limited. One of the lasting impacts of monastic medicine was the preservation of medical knowledge. Ancient texts, fragile and rare, were copied and recopied by hand. Works attributed to earlier Greek and Roman physicians survived not because they were perfectly understood, but because monks believed knowledge itself was sacred. Marginal notes accumulated over generations, reflecting lived experience. Warnings, adjustments, and observations added quietly beside inherited theory. This blending of past authority and present experience formed a bridge between ancient medicine and later medieval and early modern practice. Equally important was the concept of dedicated care spaces. The infirmary was not merely a room, but a philosophy. The sick were separated from the healthy, monitored consistently, and provided with conditions that favored recovery. Light, warmth, cleanliness, and rest were prioritized in ways that contrasted sharply with the conditions most medieval people endured at home. These spaces normalized the idea that illness required environment, routine, and patience, not just intervention. Monastic medicine also influenced how society viewed responsibility toward the sick. Care was not limited to monks alone. Travelers, peasants, and the poor were often admitted, particularly during epidemics or harsh seasons. This practice reinforced the idea that healing was a communal obligation rather than a private burden. While outcomes varied, the act of providing shelter, food, and attention often meant survival where abandonment would have meant death. Over centuries, these practices quietly shaped emerging medical institutions. Hospitals that appeared later in medieval towns borrowed heavily from monastic models. Structured schedules, record-keeping, segregation of patients, and the integration of spiritual and physical care. Even when medicine began to secularize, the foundational habits of discipline, observation, and documentation remained. The limitations of monastic medicine were real and severe. Many diseases remained untreatable. Epidemics still overwhelmed abbeys despite precautions. Bloodletting, purging, and ineffective remedies sometimes caused harm. Yet within those limits, monks demonstrated a critical principle: knowing when not to act, avoiding unnecessary intervention, providing rest, and maintaining stability often improved outcomes more reliably than aggressive treatment. This restraint, born of experience rather than theory, saved lives quietly and repeatedly. The human cost of this work was often borne in silence. Healers aged early, their bodies worn by labor, exposure, and loss. They formed bonds with patients they could not save and returned, day after day, to the same uncertain task. Success was rarely celebrated. Failure was absorbed as part of duty. In this way, monastic medicine cultivated emotional endurance alongside practical skill. Perhaps most striking is how ordinary this labor was. There were no heroic cures, no dramatic breakthroughs. Healing unfolded through repetition: washing, feeding, watching, waiting. It was slow, methodical, and deeply human. In a time defined by instability, famine, war, plague, the infirmary offered something rare: continuity. As you imagine leaving the abbey, passing through cool stone corridors into the open air, it becomes clear that monastic medicine was never meant to conquer death. It was meant to stand against neglect. Its legacy is not found in singular discoveries, but in the habits of care that shaped how societies learned to respond to vulnerability. And that leaves a final reflection lingering in the quiet. If so many lives were preserved not by cures, but by patience, structure, and presence, how different might history look if the slow, disciplined work of care had not taken root behind monastery walls long before medicine had the tools to do anything more. Story 7. Winter in Stone: Surviving Cold, Damp, and Illness Inside Medieval Castles. As winter settles in, the castle changes. What once felt like a place of protection begins to reveal its other nature: cold, damp, and unyielding. You step inside thick stone walls meant to keep enemies out, only to realize they also trap cold air, moisture, and darkness. Fires burn, but their warmth barely reaches beyond a few feet. The deeper you move into the castle, the more you understand that surviving winter here is not a matter of comfort, but endurance. Stone is an unforgiving material in cold months. During summer, its thickness provides relief from heat. In winter, it becomes a reservoir of chill. Walls absorb cold overnight and release it slowly throughout the day, ensuring that interiors remain perpetually cold no matter how large the hearth fire burns. Floors of bare stone sap warmth from the body, while ceilings drip with condensation as warm air meets frozen masonry. Every surface seems to pull heat away from you. Castles were not designed for comfort. They were designed for defense. Windows were narrow slits to prevent entry, which also limited sunlight and airflow. Heavy doors blocked drafts but were opened frequently for guards, servants, and supplies, allowing cold air to surge inside. Tapestries were hung not for decoration, but to create thin barriers against damp stone. Even so, rooms rarely warmed evenly, and moving from one space to another meant passing through sharp shifts in temperature. Fireplaces were the primary source of heat, but they were inefficient. Large hearths consumed vast amounts of wood, yet much of the heat escaped up the chimney. Smaller rooms might have braziers, but these produced smoke and carried the constant risk of fire or suffocation. Maintaining fires required labor around the clock cutting wood, hauling it inside, keeping embers alive overnight. If supplies ran low, warmth was rationed just like food. Dampness was as dangerous as cold. Moisture crept into bedding, clothing, and food stores. Straw mattresses absorbed humidity, becoming breeding grounds for mold and parasites. Wool garments prized for insulation took days to dry and often remained stiff and cold. The smell of mildew was constant, and respiratory illnesses flourished in these conditions. Coughs lingered, joints stiffened, and minor infections became serious threats when bodies were weakened by cold and poor nutrition. Illness spread easily during winter confinement. People spent more time indoors, sharing air thick with smoke and moisture. Latrines froze or overflowed, increasing contamination. Water sources became unreliable as pipes cracked and wells iced over. Hygiene suffered, not from neglect, but from practicality. Washing in freezing water was painful and dangerous. As a result, skin infections, fevers, and digestive illnesses became common. Sleeping was one of the greatest challenges. Beds were layered with straw, wool, and fur, yet cold crept in from below and around. Multiple people often slept together for warmth, regardless of status. Even nobles shared chambers with servants during extreme cold. Nighttime was particularly dangerous, as body temperatures dropped and fires burned low. Waking to numb limbs and shallow breathing was not unusual, especially among the elderly or very young. Castles also amplified sound in winter silence. Wind howled through arrow slits, ice cracked in walls, snow sliding from roofs echoed like distant movement. Guards on night watch strained to distinguish weather from threat, remaining alert for hours in freezing conditions. Fatigue set in quickly, increasing the risk of mistakes. A moment's lapse missing a signal, failing to stoke a fire, neglecting a door could have serious consequences. Food changed with the season as well. Fresh supplies disappeared, replaced by salted meat, dried grains, and preserved vegetables. These foods sustained life but offered little comfort or nutrition variety. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making the cold even more dangerous. Kitchens struggled to keep water liquid and fires burning long enough to cook safely. Meals became simpler, repetitive, and essential rather than enjoyable. Clothing was layered but heavy. Linen undergarments trapped moisture. Wool outer layers itched and stiffened in damp air. Boots froze overnight and had to be softened near fires before they could be worn. Gloves were rare and cumbersome. Fingers numbed quickly, making even simple tasks difficult. Dropping tools, fumbling latches, or losing grip on weapons became common hazards. Psychologically, winter weighed heavily on castle inhabitants. Darkness arrived early and lingered. Activity slowed, routines tightened, and patience wore thin. Confined spaces increased tension among residents. Minor disagreements escalated more easily when everyone was cold, tired, and hungry. The castle, meant to be a symbol of power and safety, began to feel like a test of endurance imposed by the environment itself. Children and the elderly suffered the most. Small bodies lost heat quickly, while older ones struggled to regulate temperature. Extra care was required: additional bedding, closer proximity to fires, constant supervision. Yet resources were limited, and choices had to be made. Survival often depended on prioritization, forcing difficult decisions that weighed heavily on those responsible for managing the household. Despite all this, life continued. Duties were performed, watches kept, and routines maintained because abandoning structure meant inviting disaster. Winter was not survived through comfort but through discipline. Fires were tended, doors sealed, and movements minimized. Every action was deliberate, aimed at conserving energy and heat. As you stand in a stone corridor, breath visible in the air, listening to the wind press against walls that cannot yield, you begin to understand a quiet truth. The greatest threat in winter was not an invading army, but the castle itself. And that leads to an unsettling question: when stone walls offered protection at the cost of warmth and health, how did people adapt their daily lives, their habits, and even their expectations just to endure until spring arrived? By midwinter, survival inside the castle depends less on strength and more on habit. You begin to notice that nothing is left to chance. Every movement, every task, every allocation of space is shaped by the need to conserve heat, energy, and morale. The castle becomes a machine operating at its slowest, most deliberate setting, designed not for comfort, but for persistence. Daily routines tighten as daylight shortens. People rise later and move less. Unnecessary travel between rooms is avoided, especially through corridors exposed to wind or damp. Doors are kept shut as much as possible, even when this creates inconvenience or congestion. Spaces near hearths become communal, with people clustering together regardless of rank. Hierarchy softens in winter. Warmth becomes a shared priority that overrides social distance. Fire management dominates daily life. Fires are not allowed to burn freely. They are carefully rationed, stoked just enough to keep embers alive through the night. Ashes banked over coals to preserve heat until morning. Servants rotate shifts to ensure no hearth goes unattended, because relighting a dead fire in freezing conditions wastes fuel and time. Wood stores are monitored obsessively. Each log represents not comfort but survival. Sleeping arrangements change with the season. Private chambers are often abandoned in favor of shared rooms closer to heat sources. Beds are moved, straw replaced more frequently to prevent dampness, and extra layers added beneath sleepers to insulate from stone floors. People sleep clothed, sometimes wearing hats or cloaks to reduce heat loss. Blankets are layered strategically, heavier ones placed underneath rather than on top, trapping warmth more effectively. Movement is minimized. Tasks are grouped to reduce trips through cold spaces. Supplies are brought in batches rather than individually. Guards rotate more frequently, not out of kindness but necessity. Cold dulls attention, and exhaustion leads to mistakes. Watches are shorter, and shelters are built along walls to break the wind. Even so, frostbite and numbness are constant risks. Food preparation adapts to the cold. Kitchens operate continuously, not just to feed people but to maintain heat. Large pots simmer for hours, producing both meals and warmth. Broths and stews dominate, chosen not for flavor but for efficiency. Hot food is distributed strategically, prioritizing those exposed to cold, such as guards and laborers. Eating becomes functional, time to restore energy rather than mark social occasions. Water management is another quiet challenge. Buckets freeze overnight, wells ice over, pipes crack. Water is stored indoors when possible, though this increases contamination risks. Snow is melted as a last resort, often producing water of questionable quality. Washing is reduced to essentials: hands, faces, wounds, because full bathing risks hypothermia. Cleanliness becomes selective, focused on preventing infection rather than comfort. Clothing is repaired constantly. Seams split in stiff fabric. Soles crack. Wool shrinks and hardens in damp conditions. Small tears are mended immediately because exposed skin loses heat rapidly. Layers are adjusted throughout the day, adding or removing garments as people move between rooms. Belts and cords are loosened to allow circulation. Nothing about dress is decorative. Everything is functional. Illness management becomes more cautious in winter. People showing signs of fever or weakness are kept near heat sources and given priority for warm food. Isolation is attempted when possible, but space is limited. Care focuses on rest and warmth rather than intervention. Cold suppresses recovery, and everyone understands that unnecessary movement can turn minor illness into fatal decline. Psychologically, routines serve another purpose. They anchor time. In winter, days blur together, marked only by cold and darkness. Structured tasks: fire tending, food preparation, watch changes give shape to otherwise endless hours. Even prayer schedules provide comfort through predictability. Knowing what comes next matters when progress towards spring feels impossibly distant. Noise levels change as well. Activity slows, footsteps soften, and conversations grow shorter. Sound carries differently in cold air, and silence becomes a constant companion. People speak less, conserving energy and breath. When voices do rise, tension is often close beneath the surface. Confined living magnifies irritations, and winter disputes are remembered long after thaw. Animals inside the castle are managed carefully. Horses require shelter, fodder, and water that does not freeze. Chickens and other small livestock may be kept indoors, adding warmth but also smell and disease risk. Their survival matters because animals represent transport, food, and labor once spring arrives. Losing them to cold is a setback the household cannot afford. Children adapt quickly, learning where to sit, when to move, and how to stay warm through imitation. Play becomes subdued and indoor, often centered near hearths. Elders conserve energy, moving less and relying on others. The castle community adjusts itself instinctively, each person finding a role that balances contribution with preservation. Maintenance work never fully stops. Ice damage to walls, leaks in roofs, and frozen mechanisms must be addressed even in the cold. Repairs are slower and more dangerous. Tools are stiff. Fingers numb quickly. Yet neglecting these issues allows damp and cold to worsen, compounding the danger. Maintenance in winter is not improvement, it is prevention. Despite every strategy, winter always takes something. Weight is lost, strength diminishes, chronic aches deepen. Survival is measured not by comfort but by avoiding irreversible decline. People learn to recognize warning signs in themselves and others. Shivering that does not stop, confusion, persistent coughs. Intervention is quiet and practical: extra food, closer proximity to fire, enforced rest. As the weeks drag on, hope becomes a discipline. Spring is not felt, only remembered. The castle endures through habit rather than optimism. Each day completed is its own success. The walls remain standing, the fires still burn, and life continues, reduced but intact. Standing near a hearth, watching shadows flicker across damp stone, you begin to understand that winter survival inside a castle was not heroic. It was careful, repetitive, and often joyless. And that leads to a deeper question. When endurance depended so completely on routine and restraint, how close did people come day after day to the point where one broken habit, one failed fire, or one careless decision could turn survival into sudden catastrophe? By the time winter begins to loosen its grip, the castle is not the same place it was in autumn. Neither are the people inside it. Survival through months of cold, damp, and confinement leaves marks that are not always visible at first glance. Weight is lost, strength is diminished, coughs linger, joints ache more deeply. Even as daylight slowly returns, bodies and routines carry the memory of restraint and endurance. Spring does not arrive suddenly inside a castle. Stone walls warm slowly, releasing cold long after snow melts outside. Moisture trapped in masonry continues to seep into rooms, and fires remain necessary even as the air softens. The transition is gradual, and during this period, illness often peaks. Weakened immune systems, accumulated fatigue, and damp conditions combine to make recovery uncertain. Many who survived winter succumbed in its aftermath, their bodies unable to rebound. These cycles shaped medieval expectations of health. Winter was understood not merely as a season, but as a trial. Surviving it was considered an achievement in itself. People expected to feel diminished afterward, and communities adjusted accordingly. Heavy labor resumed slowly. Diets were expanded cautiously. Those who could afford it prioritized rest and warmth well into spring. Survival was not about returning to full strength quickly, but about avoiding collapse. Over generations, these experiences influenced castle design. Builders added smaller chambers that were easier to heat, reduced ceiling heights in private rooms, and incorporated features like hooded fireplaces to retain warmth. Wooden paneling and raised floors became more common, not for luxury, but necessity. Even the placement of staircases and corridors reflected lessons learned about airflow and heat loss. Architecture evolved quietly, shaped by countless winters endured rather than theoretical planning. Health practices adapted as well. Greater emphasis was placed on layering, bedding quality, and proximity to heat. Castle households learned to stockpile more fuel than seemed necessary, knowing that winter shortages were unforgiving. Storage rooms were redesigned to protect food from damp, and kitchens became central gathering spaces during cold months. These changes were incremental, often unnoticed in records, but deeply informed by lived experience. Psychologically, winter left lasting impressions. People became acutely aware of vulnerability to environment, to illness, to simple mistakes. This awareness shaped behavior long after the cold receded. Conservatism in movement, caution in spending energy, and respect for routine lingered. Even in summer, habits formed during winter persisted, closing doors quickly, tending fires carefully, layering clothing instinctively. For children who grew up in castles, winter was formative. They learned early how fragile comfort could be, how dependent survival was on collective discipline. These lessons followed them into adulthood, shaping how they managed households, commanded garrisons, or organized labor. Winter was not remembered as a single event, but as a pattern that defined responsibility. The castle itself bore scars. Cracked stone, warped wood, soot-darkened ceilings, and lingering dampness required repair once warmth returned. Maintenance crews worked to undo months of stress imposed by cold and moisture. Some damage could be fixed, some could not. Over time, repeated winters shortened the lifespan of structures, contributing to decay and abandonment when resources or manpower ran out. Perhaps most importantly, winter reinforced a quiet truth. Castles protected against human enemies far better than they protected against nature. Thick walls and high towers offered little comfort when heat could not be retained and moisture could not be expelled. Survival depended not on the strength of stone, but on the adaptability of those living within it. As you imagine the first mild days of spring filtering into cold rooms, fires still burning despite the light outside, it becomes clear that winter inside a castle was never truly over. Its effects stretched forward, shaping architecture, health, and behavior in subtle but lasting ways. And that leaves a final reflection lingering in the quiet aftermath. If survival required months of discipline, restraint, and collective effort just to endure the cold, how many medieval lives were defined less by dramatic events and more by the simple, exhausting act of making it through one winter after another? Story 8: The Great Hall. Feasts, Fights, and Accidental Deaths. When you enter the Great Hall of a medieval castle, you step into what appears to be its heart. This is the largest enclosed space, the most animated and the most socially important room within the walls. Here, people eat, work, argue, celebrate, judge, and endure the long hours of daylight and darkness together. From a distance, the Great Hall looks like a place of warmth and abundance. But spend enough time inside it, and you begin to understand that it was also one of the most dangerous places in the castle. The Great Hall was not designed for comfort. It was designed for visibility and control. High ceilings allowed smoke to rise from the central hearth, but they also trapped cold air above. Long wooden tables filled most of the floor space, leaving narrow paths for movement. Benches were hard and backless. The stone floor beneath was often strewn with rushes reeds meant to absorb spills, dirt, and waste which were replaced infrequently. Over time, these rushes became layered with food scraps, spilled ale, grease, and parasites. Despite this, the hall was where almost everyone spent their time. Lords held court here. Meals were eaten communally. Servants worked in full view. Guards rested between duties. During winter, people crowded closer to the hearth. During feasts, the space became packed with bodies, noise, and activity. The density of people alone made accidents inevitable. Fire was the most constant hazard. Open hearths burned day and night, especially during colder months. Sparks leapt unpredictably, landing on clothing, rushes, or wooden furniture. Ale-soaked floors and greasy refuse increased the risk. A single spark could smolder unnoticed before igniting suddenly. Fires spread quickly in enclosed spaces, and smoke inhalation often killed before flames did. Even when a fire was contained, Burns were common, especially among servants moving quickly through crowded spaces with heavy dishes. Lighting added another layer of danger. Candles and oil lamps were placed along walls, on tables, and near doorways. They were knocked over easily during moments of excitement, argument, or intoxication. Wax dripped onto skin and clothing. Oil spilled and caught fire. In the absence of proper ventilation, smoke thickened the air, irritating eyes and lungs and increasing confusion during emergencies. Feasts, which appear celebratory in surviving imagery, were particularly risky. Large quantities of alcohol were consumed, often by people unaccustomed to restraint. Ale and wine flowed freely, weakening coordination and judgment. Knives were everywhere, used for eating, carving, and cutting bread. There were no forks, and personal blades were worn at the belt even indoors. A careless gesture, a stumble, or a heated argument could turn deadly in seconds. Food itself posed dangers. Meat was not always fresh, and preservation methods were imperfect. Undercooked or spoiled food caused illness, sometimes severe. Bones were common choking hazards, especially during hurried eating. Hot stews and broths caused burns when spilled. Serving staff moved quickly, balancing heavy trays in crowded conditions, often slipping on greasy floors or uneven rushes. Noise was constant and overwhelming. The acoustics of the hall amplified voices, laughter, arguments, and the clatter of dishes. Misunderstandings were common. Commands were misheard. Insults were perceived where none were intended. Tensions that had simmered privately erupted publicly under the influence of alcohol and proximity. Fights broke out frequently, sometimes with fists, sometimes with weapons already in hand. Social hierarchy did not eliminate danger, it redistributed it. Lords sat at raised tables, but even they were not immune. Spilled drinks, thrown food, or sudden violence could reach anyone. Assassinations were rare but feared, and poisoning, real or imagined, was a constant concern. Food tasters existed not out of paranoia, but experience. Illness following a feast was common enough to inspire suspicion, whether justified or not. Servants faced the greatest risk. They worked closest to fires, carried heavy loads, and navigated the most dangerous paths. Burns, cuts, and falls were occupational hazards. A servant who dropped food or stumbled could be beaten or dismissed. Fatigue increased mistakes, especially during long feasts that lasted hours. Many injuries went untreated beyond basic bandaging, becoming infected or disabling. The hall was also a legal and administrative space. Disputes were settled, punishments declared, and judgments enforced in full view of the household. Emotions ran high. Those accused or punished sometimes resisted, leading to violence. Public humiliation added psychological strain to already volatile gatherings. Children moved through the hall constantly, often unsupervised. They learned early how to avoid trampling feet, swinging elbows, and hot surfaces. Yet accidents happened. Burns, scalds, and crushing injuries were not uncommon. The hall taught survival through awareness, not protection. Even sleep occurred here. Lower status individuals often slept on benches or floors near the hearth, especially in winter. Nighttime introduced new hazards, embers shifting, people stumbling in the dark, fires flaring unexpectedly. Smoke built up when airflow decreased. People slept lightly, if at all, aware that danger did not pause when the hall quieted. Cleanliness was minimal by necessity. Waste accumulated throughout the day. Animals sometimes entered the hall, dogs, cats, even poultry, adding to the chaos. Fleas and lice thrived in the rushes and bedding. Disease spread easily in such conditions, particularly during long winters when ventilation was limited. Yet despite all this, the Great Hall remained indispensable. It was the only space large enough to gather everyone. It enforced visibility, reinforced authority, and maintained a sense of collective life. People accepted its dangers because there was no alternative. Safety was not expected, awareness was. Standing in the center of the hall, surrounded by firelight, noise, and movement, you begin to see it not as a place of celebration, but of exposure. Every person inside is vulnerable to accident, to illness, to conflict, to simple misjudgment. And that leads to an unsettling thought. In a space where nearly every daily activity occurred under crowded, hazardous conditions, how often did medieval lives change or end not through grand events, but through ordinary moments in the most familiar room of all? The Great Hall was not only a place where people gathered, it was a place where order was performed. Every bench, table, and raised platform reinforced who mattered and who did not. When you sit in the hall long enough, you begin to see that danger did not come only from fire or blades, but from proximity, how close people were forced to be to power, to resentment, and to one another. Seating arrangements were never casual. Position in the hall reflected rank with careful precision. The lord and his family sat at the high table, elevated and often backed by a wall or tapestry. This gave them visibility over the room and physical protection from behind. Below them, household officials, knights, retainers, and guests filled the central tables. Servants and laborers occupied the margins, standing or sitting where space allowed. Everyone knew where they belonged, and deviation was noticed immediately. This constant visibility intensified social pressure. Meals were not private affairs. Eating, drinking, and speaking happened under watchful eyes. A misstep, spilling drink, speaking out of turn, showing disrespect could provoke punishment or ridicule. For those lower in rank, tension never fully relaxed. Even moments of celebration carried risk, because joy could be misread as insolence. Alcohol sharpened these risks. Ale and wine were consumed daily, not only during feasts. Drinking was expected, but restraint was uneven. Some people became loud, others aggressive. Old grudges surfaced. Small insults grew larger in the echoing space. Because weapons were worn openly, escalation required little effort. A hand already rested near a knife. A bench leg could become a club. Violence was rarely planned, but often immediate. The hall amplified sound and emotion. Raised voices traveled quickly, drawing attention and participants. Once an argument began, it was difficult to contain. Others joined, either to support, to provoke, or simply because they could not avoid involvement. In crowded conditions, bystanders were easily injured, trampled, struck, or knocked into fires. Chaos spread faster than authority could respond. Attempts at order were constant but imperfect. Household officials monitored behavior, intervening when disputes threatened to disrupt the gathering. Guards stood near entrances and the high table ready to step in. Yet enforcement was reactive, not preventative. By the time a conflict was visible, damage was often already done. Injuries were accepted as part of hall life, addressed after the fact rather than avoided. Justice was also public in the Great Hall, adding another layer of danger. Accusations were voiced openly. Punishments were announced and sometimes carried out on the spot. Those facing judgment stood exposed before the entire household. Fear, anger, and desperation mixed freely. Resistance was rare but not unheard of. A condemned person might lash out, attempt escape, or provoke sympathy that turned volatile. The hall also served as a place of negotiation. Alliances forged, marriages discussed, disputes settled between families. These conversations happened in semi-public conditions, where privacy was limited and eavesdropping common. Misunderstandings spread quickly. A remark overheard out of context could inflame tensions long after the meal ended. Information moved as freely as food, and not always accurately. For women, the Great Hall presented its own risks. While noblewomen held authority within the household, their movements and speech were closely observed. Lower status women, especially servants, were vulnerable to harassment and coercion. Crowded conditions made unwanted contact easy and accountability difficult. Complaints rarely led to consequences unless property or hierarchy was threatened. Children learned early that the hall was not a safe space in the modern sense. They were expected to move quietly, avoid interfering with adults, and learn through observation rather than instruction. Mistakes were corrected harshly. Injury was treated as a lesson. Survival in the hall depended on awareness, adaptability, and knowing when to disappear into the background. Even moments of calm carried tension. Silence after a meal when people lingered near dying fires was not peaceful. It was watchful. Eyes tracked movement. Conversations lowered. Everyone was aware that proximity could turn dangerous without warning. Fatigue added to this unease. Long days, poor sleep, and inadequate nutrition shortened tempers and dulled judgment. Hierarchy did not guarantee safety for those at the top. Lords were targets of resentment, ambition, and fear. While outright assassination was rare, accidents and misunderstandings happened. A pushed elbow, a spilled cup, a knife used too close to the body. Suspicion followed any injury or illness after a gathering. Trust was fragile in a space where everyone was visible and vulnerable. The physical layout of the hall reinforced these dynamics. Long tables limited escape routes. Fires occupied central positions. Narrow doors created bottlenecks. In emergencies, people moved toward familiar exits, often trampling those who fell. Design favored control and symbolism over safety. The hall communicated power, not protection. Over time, people adapted. They learned where to stand, when to speak, and how to read the mood of the room. Survival depended on social awareness as much as physical caution. Knowing when to leave a gathering early could prevent injury. Choosing silence over response could avoid escalation. These were not taught formally. They were absorbed through observation and consequence. As you sit quietly in the imagined hall, watching figures shift on benches, listening to the low murmur of voices and the crackle of fire, it becomes clear that danger was woven into the social fabric of the space. The hall did not merely host conflict, it magnified it. And this raises a troubling question. In a room designed to display order and unity, how often did the very structure meant to bind people together instead push them toward fracture and violence? By the end of any long gathering in the Great Hall, the signs of strain were visible everywhere. Benches were askew. Rushes were crushed into the stone floor, damp with spilled drink and grease. Fires burned lower, their embers uneven and unpredictable. People moved more slowly, less carefully. This was the moment when accidents most often occurred, not during the height of excitement, but in its aftermath. Many deaths in the Great Hall were never recorded as such. They appeared in chronicles only as brief mentions. A servant who fell ill, a retainer who did not recover, a guest who died shortly after the feast. Behind these phrases were burns that became infected, blows to the head dismissed as minor, and smoke inhalation that weakened lungs already strained by damp living conditions. The hall created injuries that did not always kill immediately, but set decline in motion. Falls were common and dangerous. Stone floors were unforgiving. A slip while carrying food or drink could result in broken bones or head trauma. Without effective medical intervention, these injuries often led to infection or long-term disability. A fall near a hearth was worse. Clothing could ignite. Even when flames were extinguished quickly, burns frequently became fatal days or weeks later. Choking was another quiet killer. Meat was eaten in large pieces, often hastily. Alcohol dulled reflexes. A lodged bone could suffocate someone before help arrived. In a noisy hall, distress might go unnoticed until it was too late. Even when recognized, there were limited means to intervene. Death could occur within moments, witnessed but unavoidable. Violence, when it erupted, rarely resembled organized combat. It was chaotic and close. A shove led to a fall. A knife meant for eating became a weapon. People were struck not out of malice, but panic or reflex. Bystanders were injured as frequently as participants. The hall's design offered little protection. Tables and benches became obstacles rather than shelter. Fire-related deaths extended beyond burns. Smoke inhalation was a persistent threat, especially at night when ventilation decreased. People sleeping in the hall sometimes failed to wake as smoke thickened. Others stumbled into embers while disoriented. Fire was essential but never fully controlled. Its presence demanded constant attention, and lapses were costly. Disease spread efficiently in the hall. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation and shared utensils allowed illness to move quickly through the household. A single sick individual could infect dozens. During outbreaks, the hall transformed from communal space to liability. Yet isolation was difficult, and gatherings often continued out of necessity. The hall could not be abandoned without disrupting daily life. These dangers shaped behavior over time. People became cautious not because they expected safety, but because experience taught them consequences. Survival depended on anticipating risk rather than avoiding it. This mindset extended beyond the hall into broader medieval life. Danger was accepted as an ordinary companion, managed through habit rather than eliminated through design. The Great Hall also shaped ideas of community. Shared risk created bonds, but it also normalized loss. Death within the household was not shocking, it was expected. Grief was real, but often brief. Life continued around absence. A place at the table might remain empty for a time, then be filled again. Continuity mattered more than individual memory. Over generations, some changes emerged. Wealthier households introduced smaller dining chambers for private meals. Fires were enclosed. Table manners evolved slowly, encouraging restraint. Yet the Great Hall remained central because its function outweighed its danger. It was where authority was seen, where identity was reinforced, and where daily life unfolded in public. Standing in the quiet aftermath of an imagined feast, with only embers glowing and the smell of smoke lingering in the air, you can sense how fragile survival was in this familiar space. The Great Hall was not a backdrop to history. It was a participant. It shaped behavior, reinforced hierarchy, and quietly claimed lives through ordinary moments. And so, the final reflection lingers. When the most dangerous place in the castle was also the most important, how did generations of people learn to live with the knowledge that community itself, crowded, necessary, and inescapable, was one of their greatest risks? Story 9. The Latrine Tower, Waste, Disease, and the Hidden Architecture of Survival. If you follow the narrow passages of a medieval castle far enough, away from hearths and halls, past chambers meant for living in authority, you eventually reach spaces that were never intended to be noticed. These are the latrine towers, guardrobes, and waste chute structures designed not for comfort or defense, but for managing what every human body inevitably produces. They are rarely celebrated, rarely described in detail, and yet they were essential to survival within stone walls. From the outside, a latrine tower often appears as a small projection from the main wall, sometimes little more than a vertical slit in the masonry. Inside, it is stark and utilitarian. A stone or wooden seat is set above a vertical shaft. There is no privacy beyond distance, no plumbing, no real sanitation in the modern sense. Gravity does the work, carrying waste down into pits, moats, or open ground below. The location of these structures was deliberate. Latrines were placed along outer walls to keep waste as far from living spaces as possible, but this distance was relative. In a confined castle, there was no truly safe separation between waste and life. Smells traveled through corridors. Moisture seeped into stone. Insects moved freely between filth and food. The castle lived with its waste constantly, even when it tried not to see it. Using a latrine was not a private or comfortable act. Seats were often shared, unpartitioned, and exposed to drafts. In winter, stone seats became painfully cold. In summer, smells intensified. There was no running water to clean surfaces. Some castles used straw, moss, or cloth for wiping, all of which had to be disposed of afterward. Hands were washed infrequently, if at all, increasing the spread of disease. The dangers were not limited to discomfort. Latrine shafts were hazardous places. People fell in. Children slipped. Structural failures caused collapses. A fall into a waste pit was often fatal, not just from injury, but from infection or suffocation. Rescue was difficult and dangerous. These incidents were rarely recorded in detail, but archaeological evidence suggests they were not uncommon. Waste accumulation created ongoing problems. Pits filled faster than expected, especially during sieges when populations swelled and movement was restricted. Overflow contaminated water sources. Moats, often imagined as defensive features, became stagnant reservoirs of human waste, animal remains, and refuse. Rather than protecting health, they frequently became sources of disease. Maintenance was constant and unpleasant. Someone had to empty pits, clear blockages, and repair structures damaged by moisture and corrosion. These tasks fell to the lowest status workers who faced significant health risks. Exposure to waste led to infections, parasites, and chronic illness. Protective equipment did not exist. The work was dangerous, degrading, and essential. Design adaptations emerged slowly. Some latrine towers were angled to direct waste away from walls. Others incorporated multiple shafts to distribute load. Ventilation openings were added to reduce odor buildup. None of these changes eliminated the underlying problem. Human waste in a closed environment is difficult to manage safely without technology that did not yet exist. Disease spread easily through these systems. Contaminated hands touched food. Insects moved between waste and living spaces. Water sources became polluted during heavy rain or overflow. Dysentery, intestinal parasites, and other illnesses were common. During outbreaks, latrines became focal points of fear and suspicion, even if people did not fully understand how disease spread. Despite all this, latrine towers were considered marks of sophistication. Castles without them relied on buckets or open ground, which posed even greater risks. The presence of a dedicated waste system, however crude, represented an attempt at order. It was an acknowledgement that survival required managing not just enemies and weather, but the body itself. Privacy, when it existed, was a privilege. Lords might have private guardrobes connected to their chambers, while servants shared communal facilities. Yet even private latrines were not hygienic. They simply reduced exposure and inconvenience. Smell and risk persisted regardless of status. Over time, people developed habits to cope. Certain times of day were preferred for use. Rushes or herbs were placed nearby to mask odor. Windows were opened when possible. These small adaptations made the experience tolerable but never safe. The latrine remained a place of vulnerability. Standing near a latrine tower, listening to the wind move through stone and the distant sounds of the castle beyond, you realize how much effort went into hiding this aspect of life. Waste was pushed to the margins physically and socially, yet it shaped health, mortality, and daily routine more than most celebrated features of castle life. And this leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If managing waste was so dangerous, so poorly understood, and so essential, how many lives were quietly shortened not by war or famine, but by the very systems meant to keep the castle livable? Most of the time, the latrine system functioned just well enough to be ignored. That was its purpose. As long as waste disappeared downward and away, daily life could proceed without dwelling on the risks beneath the stone seats and shafts. But when these systems failed or were overwhelmed, the consequences were immediate, visible, and often deadly. Failure rarely announced itself dramatically at first. It began quietly. A latrine shaft drained more slowly than usual. Odors lingered longer in nearby corridors. Flies increased in number, clustering near food stores and hearths. Water drawn from wells tasted different. These were warning signs, though they were not always recognized as such. People noticed discomfort before danger. The most common trigger was overuse. During sieges, winter confinement, or periods of increased population, latrine pits filled rapidly. Castles designed for a few dozen residents suddenly housed hundreds. Waste accumulated faster than it could be removed. Gravity, the system's only mechanism, could not compensate for volume. Overflow followed predictable paths, seeping into walls, draining into moats, or backing up into shafts. Once waste entered the castle's broader environment, containment was effectively lost. Moisture carried contaminants into stonework where it lingered. Insects bred rapidly. Rodents followed. These creatures moved freely between latrines, kitchens, and sleeping areas, spreading pathogens without intention or awareness. The castle became an enclosed ecosystem, recycling its own waste back into daily life. Water contamination was particularly dangerous. Wells were often shallow and located within the walls for security. When latrine pits overflowed or leaked, waste seeped into groundwater. Rain accelerated this process, carrying surface contaminants into wells and cisterns. Drinking water, already limited, became a source of illness. Symptoms appeared quickly: stomach pain, diarrhea, fever, dehydration. In severe cases, death followed within days. Disease outbreaks rarely affected only one person. Illness moved through the household in waves, striking those already weakened by poor nutrition, cold, or exhaustion. Children, the elderly, and servants were especially vulnerable. Caregivers fell ill next, reducing the capacity to respond. Work slowed. Fires went untended. Food preparation suffered. The breakdown was systemic. Medical understanding offered little protection. While medieval practitioners recognized patterns: bad smells, foul water, seasonal illness, they lacked tools to interrupt transmission effectively. Remedies focused on balancing bodily humors, improving air quality, or purging the body. These treatments sometimes helped, sometimes harmed, and rarely addressed the root cause. The latrine remained in place, continuing to contaminate the environment. Attempts at intervention were practical rather than medical. Pits were emptied when possible, though this was dangerous and labor-intensive. Workers lowered buckets or shovels into waste, hauling it out by hand. Protective measures were minimal. Exposure was prolonged. Many who performed this work fell ill themselves, creating a cycle where those tasked with prevention became casualties. In extreme cases, latrines were sealed entirely. Access was restricted. Buckets replaced fixed seats, emptied outside the walls when conditions allowed. This solution reduced immediate contamination but introduced new risks. Waste storage indoors increased smell, insect activity, and accidental spills. Disposal trips exposed workers to enemy fire during sieges or to harsh weather in winter. Every option carried danger. Social responses to outbreaks were shaped by fear and hierarchy. Blame traveled downward. Servants were accused of negligence. Waste workers were suspected of spreading illness deliberately or through carelessness. In some cases, they were dismissed or punished, even though their labor was essential. The association between filth and moral failure intensified stigma around already marginalized roles. Noble households attempted isolation when possible. Private chambers were closed. Meals were separated. Yet complete separation was impossible in a confined structure. Air circulated. Water sources were shared. Servants moved between spaces. Disease respected no rank. Even those with private guardrobes and cleaner bedding fell ill when systems failed. Smell played a powerful psychological role. Persistent odor signaled danger even when the cause was not fully understood. People associated foul air with sickness, leading to attempts at masking rather than eliminating the source. Herbs, incense, and rushes were used extensively. Windows were opened when weather permitted. Fires were kept burning to cleanse the air. These measures offered comfort more than protection. Seasonal factors worsened the situation. In summer, heat accelerated decay and insect breeding. In winter, frozen ground prevented pit emptying, causing backup. Rainfall patterns influenced groundwater contamination. The castle's waste problem was never static. It shifted with weather and population, demanding constant adaptation. Children learned to recognize danger zones instinctively. Certain corridors were avoided. Specific wells were distrusted. Latrine use was timed or minimized. These behaviors were rarely articulated formally, but passed through observation. Survival depended on shared, often unspoken knowledge of which systems could still be trusted. Over time, repeated failures influenced castle planning. New wells were dug farther from latrines. Waste shafts were extended or redirected. Some castles abandoned moats as waste receptacles entirely, recognizing their role in disease. These changes were slow and inconsistent, limited by resources and understanding, but they reflect accumulated experience rather than theory. Yet even the best designed systems could fail under pressure. The fundamental problem remained. Human waste in a closed environment without modern sanitation is a persistent threat. Medieval castles managed it imperfectly, accepting a baseline level of illness as unavoidable. Survival was measured not by elimination of risk, but by endurance through recurring outbreaks. As sickness spread and routines broke down, the latrine tower ceased to be an invisible structure. It became a focal point of fear, blame, and urgent labor. People watched it closely, listened for changes, and whispered about its condition. Something meant to remove waste quietly now dominated attention. And this leads to a difficult question as illness lingered and recovery remained uncertain. When a castle's defenses held, its food lasted, and its people endured but its waste systems failed, how often did survival hinge not on strength or strategy, but on whether filth could be kept just far enough away for one more day? By the time a latrine tower or guardrobe was finally emptied, repaired, or abandoned, its impact was already embedded in the castle and its inhabitants. The stones themselves absorbed years of moisture, pathogens, and the faint chemical traces of countless bodies. The people who lived around these structures bore